I was sitting in a dingy coffee shop staring at a weathered photo of my missing son when a stranger slid into the booth across from me. He looked at the picture and asked if I was still looking for him. He set a heavy manila folder on the table and declared that everything about the kidnapping 30 years ago was inside. I asked him how he could possibly know that. He looked me dead in the eye and said it was because he was the kid in that photo. I am DeAndre Cole. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years building a logistics empire from the ground up. Before I continue the story about how I dismantled the people who tried to bury my bloodline, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that patience and absolute truth are the most lethal weapons a man can wield. The morning had started with a brazen act of disrespect. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a forgotten diner on the edge of the city, nursing a cup of black coffee. My phone vibrated aggressively against the laminate tabletop. The screen lit up with a text message from my son-in-law, Gavin. Gavin is a 35-year-old white commercial real estate developer who married my adopted daughter, Kendra. His message was not a polite request. It was an absolute eviction notice. He demanded that I clear all my personal belongings out of the primary master suite of my own historic estate by Friday afternoon. He claimed they required the square footage to install a luxury home theater system. I did not reply. I simply turned the phone face down. Gavin mistook my silence for weakness. He assumed my retirement meant I had lost my edge. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored coat and pulled out a weathered, age-progressed photograph. It was an image of my biological son, Tariq. He was kidnapped from a local park exactly 30 years ago. The police never found him. The private investigators I hired drained my accounts and produced nothing but dead ends. I stared at the speculative face of a 34-year-old man I had never met. The grief of losing him had slowly consumed my wife, Naomi. She died of a broken heart 10 years ago. Her final words, a desperate plea for me to never stop looking. I kept that promise. I built my massive fortune in logistics, not for the status, but to fund the endless search. Gavin and Kendra believed they were my only heirs. They viewed Tariq as a ghost and my relentless search as a foolish waste of their future inheritance. The bell above the diner door jingled. A man walked in, scanning the room before his eyes locked onto my booth. He moved with a quiet, confident grace. He slid into the empty seat directly across from me. I looked at him, and my heart slammed against my ribs. The stranger possessed the exact facial structure of the age-progressed photograph resting on the table. He had Naomi's sharp jawline and my deep, calculating eyes. He dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the table between us. He delivered the words that shattered my reality. He asked if I was still looking for my son. He tapped the folder and stated that everything regarding the kidnapping 30 years ago was right there. I asked him how he possessed such specific, highly classified information. He did not hesitate. He told me it was because he was the kid in that photo. Most men would have shouted. Most men would have broken down into hysterical tears or caused a massive public scene. I did not make a single sound. I spent 4 decades surviving vicious corporate warfare by maintaining absolute control over my emotions. I stared at the man claiming to be my lost flesh and blood. I leaned forward and coldly demanded irrefutable evidence. The man nodded, fully appreciating my skepticism. He opened the manila folder. He slid a certified DNA test across the table, along with a stack of original, unaltered birth records. The genetic markers were an absolute, undeniable match. I reviewed the institutional stamps and the official medical seals. The paperwork was entirely flawless. I looked back up at the 34-year-old man sitting across from me. The desperate, agonizing search of 30 years ended in a dingy diner on a Tuesday morning. I accepted the truth instantly. My son Tariq was alive, sitting right in front of me, and he had found me first. I placed my hands flat on the table, centering my mind. I asked him where he had been and why he had chosen this exact moment to step out of the shadows. Tariq's expression hardened. He reached back into the manila folder. The reunion was not a simple stroke of luck. It was the result of a meticulously uncovered conspiracy. Tariq pulled out a bound financial document and placed a detailed bank ledger directly on top of the DNA test. He slid it toward me and pointed to a specific highlighted transaction. The transfer was for exactly $50,000. The origin account belonged to Gavin's real estate development firm. The receiving account belonged to the lead private investigator I had retained 2 years ago to chase a promising lead in Atlanta. Tariq explained the brutal reality of the situation with chilling clarity. Gavin had paid that corrupt private investigator to officially report that the trail for Tariq had gone permanently cold. My own son-in-law knew Tariq was alive and actively searching for his biological family. Gavin paid a massive bribe to keep my son away. He orchestrated the entire deception to secure Kendra's position as the sole uncontested heir to my entire logistics fortune and the historic family estate. Gavin had weaponized my grief against me. He allowed me to mourn a living son just to protect his own financial interests. The revelation ignited a cold, lethal fury deep within my chest. Gavin had smiled at me over family dinners, poured me expensive scotch, and pretended to care about my physical well-being, all while actively erasing my actual bloodline. He assumed I was an oblivious old man who would quietly fade away and hand over the keys to the kingdom. He vastly underestimated the man he was trying to rob. I looked at the bank ledger, committing the routing numbers and the dates to my memory. Tariq was not finished. He reached into the folder one last time and revealed a secondary, heavily redacted document. It was a municipal construction blueprint. Tariq explained that Gavin was not merely trying to secure an inheritance for the distant future. Gavin was planning to forcefully bulldoze my historic family estate next week to break ground on a massive new commercial development project. Gavin was moving to completely destroy the home I built with Naomi, the very home Tariq was meant to inherit. I stared at the blueprint, mentally calculating every angle of the impending war. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my coat pocket alongside my son's photograph. I looked at Tariq. I told my newly found son to stay completely in the shadows. I instructed him not to contact me or show his face until I gave the absolute signal. The time for passive observation was over. I slid out of the booth, adjusting my tailored coat. I was going back to the lion den. The hunt begins today. I drove the heavy sedan through the wrought iron gates of the estate I had purchased 20 years ago. The sprawling brick manor stood exactly as Naomi and I had envisioned it when we first escaped the grinding poverty of our youth. We had built this sanctuary to be an unbreakable fortress for our family, but the driveway told a completely different story of what this family had become. A brand new imported sports car and a massive luxury SUV sat parked carelessly across the pristine cobblestones. I had paid for those vehicles. I had signed the checks disguised as early inheritance advances, believing I was securing a stable, prosperous future for my adopted daughter. I had convinced myself that funding her lavish lifestyle would somehow fill the agonizing void left by my missing son. Now, staring at the gleaming metal reflecting the morning sun, I saw those vehicles for what they truly were. They were loud, arrogant trophies of my own willful blindness. I parked my car in the detached garage and bypassed the grand front entrance. I walked around the manicured hedges, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, and entered through the heavy kitchen service door. The house was entirely quiet except for the sharp, venomous hissing of a suppressed argument. I paused in the dim hallway, letting the shadows conceal my presence. Kendra and Gavin stood near the massive marble island. My adopted daughter clutched a stack of final collection notices, her face twisted in an ugly, entitled sneer. She demanded to know why her premium credit cards were suddenly declining at high-end boutiques across the city. Gavin paced the floor like a trapped animal, his face flushed with a dangerous, erratic energy. He told her to lower her voice and stop spending money they did not currently have in their possession. He hissed that his commercial creditors were breathing down his neck, and that he needed exactly 48 hours to secure the ultimate financial payout. He promised her that by Friday she could buy the entire boutique if she wanted to. Their unified front of a happy, successful marriage was a complete and utter fabrication. They were drowning in a sea of toxic debt, and I was their designated life raft. I stepped out of the shadows, letting my hard leather shoes strike the tile with deliberate force. The argument ceased instantly. Gavin spun around, his flushed face snapping into a mask of exaggerated, frantic concern. He marched directly toward me, completely invading my personal space with his tall frame. He aggressively shoved a thick stack of stapled documents against my chest, forcing me to take a step back. He did not ask how my morning walk went. He did not offer a single word of greeting or basic respect. He loudly declared that my corporate accountant had flagged a massive discrepancy in my previous tax filings. Gavin claimed the federal government was preparing to audit my entire logistics pension by noon unless I signed these routine update forms immediately. He handed me a silver pen, his breathing shallow and rapid. He told me to just sign the bottom lines so he could rush the paperwork to the city clerk and save our family from total financial ruin. I looked down at the stack of papers in my hands. The top sheet was heavily formatted with dense legal jargon designed specifically to confuse an elderly reader. I did not need to read the fine print to understand the threat. I had spent 40 years navigating ruthless corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. I recognized the specific layout of a property deed transfer immediately. Gavin was not saving me from a federal tax audit. He was forcing me to sign away my absolute life tenancy rights to the estate. He was legally erasing my ownership of the ground I stood on. If my signature graced the bottom of that page, the house would belong entirely to him, granting him the collateral he desperately needed to satisfy his massive hidden debts. I looked up into the eyes of the man who had paid a corrupt investigator to keep my biological son a ghost. Gavin stared back, his pupils dilated with sheer greed, waiting for the confused, grieving old man to surrender his kingdom without a fight. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the fraudulent papers back into his desperate face. Anger is a volatile emotion that signals your intentions to the enemy, giving them time to adjust their strategy. I required absolute silence to execute my response. I took the silver pen from his trembling hand. I stepped past him and placed the documents flat on the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island. I rolled my shoulders and positioned myself meticulously over the papers. I reached out and gripped the pen tightly with my left hand. I am naturally and exclusively right-handed. Gavin did not know this intimate detail. Kendra did not care enough about my daily life to ever notice which hand I used to hold a fork or sign a check. 10 years ago, shortly after Naomi passed away, I sat in the secure downtown office of my lifelong friend and merciless estate attorney, Mitchell. I knew the immense wealth I had generated from the logistics empire could eventually attract ruthless predators. Mitchell and I established an ironclad legally binding mandate registered securely with the state records. The mandate explicitly stated that any binding document, contract, or property deed bearing my signature executed with my left hand was signed under extreme duress. A left-handed signature legally invalidated the entire document the exact moment the ink dried. It was my silent panic button designed for a moment exactly like this. I pressed the pen to the paper. I carefully dragged the tip across the signature line, perfectly mimicking my standard signature while applying the awkward heavy pressure of my non-dominant hand. The ink flowed perfectly across the fraudulent lines. I signed the deed transfer. I signed the supplementary financial waivers. I signed away my home knowing the paper was already legally dead. I handed the documents back to my son-in-law. Gavin snatched the papers from the counter with the speed of a starving predator. A massive, triumphant grin spread across his face, instantly replacing his frantic anxiety. He did not even bother to say thank you or offer a fake reassurance. He turned his back on me entirely and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. As he walked swiftly down the hallway toward the grand front doors, I clearly heard him dial a number. He commanded the person on the other end of the line to mobilize the heavy machinery immediately. He explicitly ordered the contractor to schedule the complete demolition of the historic property for the following Wednesday. He boasted loudly that the title was finally clear and the ground was legally theirs to break. Kendra watched him leave, a smug, satisfied smile replacing her previous anger over the credit cards. She walked past me without a single word of gratitude and headed upstairs to resume her life of stolen luxury. I stood completely alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence of the massive house. The battle lines were officially drawn. I walked down the long corridor and entered my private study, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I moved to the large bookshelf, reached behind a row of leather-bound encyclopedias, and pulled out a hidden, heavily encrypted laptop. I sat at my mahogany desk and powered the machine on. The time for passive observation was completely over. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire existence. I navigated my heavy sedan through the labyrinth of downtown traffic, pulling into the subterranean parking garage of a heavily fortified financial high-rise. Tariq waited exactly where I instructed, standing beside a concrete pillar in the designated visitor zone. He wore a dark, unremarkable jacket, blending perfectly into the damp shadows of the underground structure. I parked and unlocked the passenger door. He slid into the vehicle without a word. We did not exchange pleasantries. The gravity of our impending war required absolute focus, leaving no room for sentimental distractions. I led him toward the restricted freight elevator, utilizing a key card I had maintained for over 2 decades. The steel doors closed, shutting out the noise of the city, and hoisted us directly to the penthouse suite of Mitchell and Associates. Mitchell was my oldest confidant. We grew up together in the same impoverished neighborhood, surviving the streets long before we conquered the corporate boardrooms. He was a brilliant, utterly merciless estate attorney who viewed the law as a weapon of mass destruction. I pushed open his heavy mahogany door and stepped into the expansive room. Mitchell stood behind his desk reviewing a stack of preliminary filings. He looked up, adjusting his glasses, prepared to offer his usual gruff greeting. The words died in his throat. He stared at the 34-year-old man standing by my side. Mitchell had spent countless nights walking the violent streets with me 30 years ago, searching desperately for a stolen child when the police utterly failed us. He walked slowly around his massive desk, his eyes locked on Tariq. He did not need a DNA test. He did not require an elaborate explanation. He recognized the shape of Naomi's eyes immediately. Mitchell pulled my son into a fierce, suffocating embrace, clapping him hard on the back. The emotional reunion lasted exactly 2 minutes before Mitchell transitioned back into a lethal legal predator. We sat around his expansive conference table. I handed him the encrypted flash drive containing the high-resolution scans of the fraudulent documents Gavin had shoved into my chest earlier that morning. Mitchell inserted the drive into his secure terminal and projected the high-resolution files directly onto the large interactive monitor mounted securely on the far wall. He immediately initiated a deeply invasive forensic trace on the forged deed and the associated banking metadata. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing standard security protocols with practiced efficiency. The audit produced a reality far more terrifying than simple theft. Mitchell pulled up the financial ledgers for Gavin's commercial real estate development firm. The company was completely bankrupt. Every single one of Gavin's corporate accounts was in the red, bleeding cash at an uncontrollable rate. He was not merely an arrogant opportunist looking to fund a lavish lifestyle for my adopted daughter. Gavin was a desperate drowning animal. He had used my forged signature to blindly guarantee a $4 million high-interest loan from an aggressive offshore lending syndicate. Mitchell explained that these specific lenders were not standard banking executives. They were dangerous criminal entities who operated entirely outside the boundaries of federal law. Gavin had leveraged my historic estate and my pristine logistics pension to pay off ruthless loan sharks. He was actively using my spotless reputation and my lifelong financial stability as an undeniable shield against immediate violent retribution from these incredibly dangerous men. If the loan defaulted, the offshore syndicate would violently seize my assets, leaving me completely destitute. Furthermore, Gavin had deliberately structured the paperwork to place the entirety of the legal liability directly onto my shoulders. When the federal investigators inevitably discovered the massive financial discrepancy, Gavin would simply testify that his elderly, confused father-in-law had squandered the funds in a state of cognitive decline. I would lose everything I had built over 40 years and face severe federal fraud charges, dying inside a maximum security penitentiary, while Gavin and Kendra lived freely on the remnants of my stolen fortune. The sheer scale of his malice was staggering. Gavin had systematically engineered a legal guillotine completely intent on dropping the blade directly onto my neck. Mitchell narrowed his eyes at the glowing monitor. He opened a secondary terminal and ran a digital penetration protocol, aggressively hacking into Gavin's master corporate calendar. Mitchell knew that a man as desperate as Gavin would inevitably leave a trail of arrogant mistakes. The screen populated with Gavin's upcoming appointments, investor meetings, and vendor deadlines. Mitchell clicked on a heavily prioritized, color-coded event scheduled prominently for this coming Friday evening at 7 o'clock sharp. Gavin had organized a massive, highly publicized, groundbreaking gala for his supposedly lucrative new luxury development. The event was set to take place at the most prestigious hotel ballroom in the city, featuring local politicians, wealthy socialites, and elite commercial real estate tycoons. Mitchell read the internal strategy notes attached to the calendar invitation. Gavin was completely out of time and out of liquid capital. The $4 million loan from the offshore syndicate merely kept him breathing for one additional week. He intended to use the lavish gala to project a flawless illusion of absolute financial stability and unrivaled, unprecedented corporate success to his oblivious guests. His ultimate goal was to dazzle the attending elite investors and secure millions in fresh, legitimate capital. He planned to accept their massive deposits based entirely on the fraudulent title to my estate. He would use the new investor funds to permanently pay off the dangerous offshore syndicate, quietly erasing his criminal footprint while leaving the legitimate investors holding a completely empty bag. It was a sophisticated, high-stakes Ponzi scheme, Gavin was attempting to sell non-existent air to the wealthiest individuals in the state, banking his entire survival on my forged signature, holding up long enough to clear his massive debts. Tariq leaned back deeply in his leather chair, silently processing the sheer magnitude of Gavin's massive criminal exposure. My son looked at the monitor, then turned to Mitchell and me. He stated that we possessed more than enough digital evidence to involve federal authorities. Tariq asked if we should immediately call the police, hand over the forged deed, and let the authorities arrest Gavin before the gala could even take place. I looked at my son and slowly shook my head. Bringing the police into the situation right now would simply allow Gavin to hire a slippery defense attorney and tie the issue up in endless, lengthy court battles. I did not want a prolonged legal negotiation. I wanted absolute, devastating destruction. I turned to Mitchell, instructing him to ignore the police entirely. I ordered him to prepare the financial infrastructure for an aggressive, hostile corporate acquisition. We were not going to stop the luxury development. We were going to utilize my vast, hidden liquid assets to quietly buy a controlling stake in the primary construction company Gavin had hired to build the project. By Friday night, I would legally own the very ground beneath his feet. I left Mitchell's towering glass office with a precise, lethal psychological strategy already formulated in my mind. Defeating Gavin required more than just absolute financial superiority. It required systematically dismantling the absolute trust between him and my adopted daughter Kendra. A united enemy is a highly dangerous enemy, but a paranoid, greedy enemy will inevitably destroy themselves from the inside out. I drove my heavy sedan back to the estate, knowing their entire marriage was built exclusively on a foundation of mutual greed and superficial status. If I introduced a sudden, massive sum of accessible cash into their volatile dynamic, their alliance would violently fracture under the weight of sheer, unadulterated entitlement. I walked into my private locked study and utilized my secure laptop to forge a highly detailed, entirely fabricated bank statement. The official-looking document displayed an active, high-yield offshore account housed securely in the Cayman Islands. I typed in a flawless, undeniably attractive balance of exactly $800,000 in liquid capital. I printed the heavy watermarked document and carried it upstairs to the primary master suite. I purposely left the statement protruding awkwardly from the top drawer of my bedside table. I ensured the bold black numbers of the massive account balance were immediately visible to anyone scanning the room for valuables. I remembered how Kendra used to ruthlessly scour my wallet for $100 bills when she was a teenager. I had foolishly dismissed that behavior as youthful rebellion rather than a permanent toxic character flaw. I knew she still possessed that exact predatory instinct. She viewed my private bedroom not as a personal sanctuary, but as a secondary bank vault waiting to be plundered. The financial bait was perfectly placed. The trap simply required a hungry, desperate animal to snap its jaws shut. I retrieved a high-definition military-grade micro-camera from my locked equipment case. I carefully wedged the tiny, imperceptible lens between the thick spines of two heavy historical biographies resting on my highest bookshelf. I meticulously angled the shot directly at the bedside table, ensuring a completely unobstructed view of the protruding document. I synchronized the live video feed to a secure encrypted application on my mobile phone. I grabbed my tailored coat and loudly announced to the empty hallway that I was leaving immediately for an unexpected, urgent cardiology appointment. I walked out the heavy oak front door, started my sedan, and drove exactly 2 blocks down the street before parking beneath the thick shade of an old neighborhood tree. I pulled out my phone and tapped open the live surveillance feed. The master suite remained utterly quiet for exactly 14 agonizing minutes. Then the heavy wooden bedroom door creaked open. Kendra slipped into my private sanctuary holding an empty wicker laundry basket against her hip. She did not immediately approach the closet or the laundry hamper. Her eyes darted aggressively around the room, hunting hungrily for anything of immediate tangible value. She abandoned the laundry basket near the foot of the bed and moved directly toward my nightstand with predatory focus. The protruding offshore bank statement caught her attention instantly. She snatched the heavy paper from the drawer with zero hesitation. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails rigidly trace the bold $800,000 balance. Her eyes widened with absolute, unadulterated greed. Her breathing visibly hitched as she processed the fabricated numbers. She did not stop to question the morality or the legality of invading my private financial records. She immediately pulled her expensive smartphone from her back pocket and aggressively dialed her husband's number. She paced back and forth across my bedroom floor, gripping the fabricated bank statement like a winning lottery ticket. I turned the volume all the way up on my phone, intensely listening to the crisp audio feed captured by the hidden microphone. Gavin answered the call on the third ring. His voice sounded sharp, frantic, and highly irritable against the loud background noise of a busy commercial construction site. Kendra did not offer a standard greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, high-pitched, venomous interrogation, completely exposing the fragile, rotting cracks in their supposedly flawless marriage. Kendra screamed violently into the phone, aggressively demanding to know why Gavin was constantly complaining about suffocating commercial debts when my bedroom held the absolute key to their immediate salvation. She waved the paper wildly in the air, shouting that her father was hiding nearly $1 million in liquid cash in an offshore account. She demanded to know why Gavin was taking out reckless high-interest loans and stressing her out daily when they could simply bully a supposedly senile old man into transferring the hidden funds directly to their personal checking accounts. The audio feed crackled sharply with Gavin's sudden explosive rage. He did not sound relieved by the news of a massive financial windfall. He sounded exactly like a cornered man whose carefully constructed web of criminal lies was suddenly threatened by a highly unpredictable variable. He violently ordered Kendra to shut her mouth and lower her voice immediately. He hissed venomously that she had absolutely no idea how complex his corporate financial restructuring actually was, and that her screaming was compromising his entire operation. Gavin aggressively commanded her to stop asking idiotic questions and immediately search the rest of the bedroom for physical passwords, digital security tokens, or any secondary ledgers associated with the offshore account. He demanded she photograph every single document in the drawer and instantly send the high-resolution files to his encrypted email server. Kendra balked at his openly hostile, dictatorial tone. She shouted back with equal ferocity, loudly claiming she was not his personal criminal assistant. She demanded he show her some basic respect after everything she had sacrificed for his failing business. Gavin viciously replied that if she wanted to keep her imported luxury cars, her expensive wardrobe, and her weekly spa treatments, she would follow his exact instructions without another word of complaint. The tense call ended abruptly with a sharp, hostile click, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Kendra stood completely frozen in the center of my bedroom. The sensitive audio feed captured her sharp, ragged, furious breathing. Their meticulously crafted, unified front of marital solidarity had shattered instantly into a toxic state of mutual aggressive suspicion. Kendra forcefully shoved the fabricated bank statement back into the drawer, violently grabbed her empty laundry basket, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I switched my phone application from the video feed to the digital clone I had established on Gavin's mobile network using a highly illegal backdoor program Mitchell had procured. The screen instantly intercepted an outgoing text message originating from Gavin's personal device. Gavin was not messaging his corporate accountant or his wealthy real estate investors. He sent a frantic, heavily coded text to an unregistered, untraceable local burner number. The message was brief and extremely volatile. Gavin demanded an emergency face-to-face meeting at exactly midnight at the abandoned industrial rail yards on the extreme edge of the city. He explicitly stated that the demolition timeline for my historic estate needed to be violently accelerated before his wife ruined everything. I stared at the intercepted digits glowing brightly on my screen. I highlighted the mysterious, dangerous phone number and immediately forwarded the contact information directly to Tariq via an encrypted, untraceable channel. I sent a brief follow-up message instructing my newly found son to gear up for a physical confrontation. The real hunt was rapidly escalating into a physical war. Tariq did not waste a single second. Within an hour of receiving the intercepted digits from my private study, he bypassed the basic encryption of the burner phone using a localized Stingray device. He traced the digital signal directly to a registered warehouse address deep in the industrial district. The number belonged to a man named Silas, a known local enforcer with a lengthy, violent criminal record involving extortion and highly destructive property damage. Tariq intercepted the incoming data packets flowing directly to Silas's device. He cracked the compressed audio files and laid the brutal, unfiltered reality bare before me. Gavin was entirely out of options and rapidly running out of time. His offshore creditors were breathing heavily down his neck, demanding an immediate injection of capital to keep his accounts solvent until the massive Friday gala. He needed liquid cash instantly, and he had devised a deeply reckless, highly illegal method to obtain it. Gavin had explicitly ordered Silas to stage a massive electrical fire in my historic guest house. The independent structure was insured for over $1 million under a rapid payout premium policy. Gavin fully intended to burn a cherished piece of my legacy to the ground, claim the insurance money as the acting property manager, and funnel the untraceable cash directly to his violent lenders. It was a desperate play to buy himself exactly 48 hours of breathing room. The sheer arrogance of the plan was staggering, but the absolute desperation behind it was lethal. He was willing to risk a massive conflagration on my property, assuming the fire might spread to the main house and eliminate me entirely simply to save his own skin. I looked at Tariq, the son I had spent my entire adult life searching for, now standing as my absolute impenetrable shield. We did not need to formulate a complex legal strategy for this specific immediate threat. We needed to prepare a brutal physical trap. We bypassed the main estate and positioned ourselves inside the guest house shortly after midnight. The structure sat 50 yards from the primary manor, surrounded by dense manicured oak trees that completely blocked the ambient city light. We killed the main electrical breakers, plunging the interior into absolute suffocating darkness. I sat in a high-backed leather armchair in the far corner of the living room, completely still. Tariq melted seamlessly into the deep shadows directly beside the heavy mahogany entryway. The silence stretched for 2 agonizing hours, broken only by the distant hum of the highway and the steady, calm rhythm of my own breathing. I possessed absolutely no fear, only a cold, highly calculated anticipation. I had hunted ruthless men in the corporate world for decades. Bringing that war into the physical realm felt remarkably familiar. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass lock on the front door clicked with a sharp metallic snap. The door eased open with a low creak, letting in a narrow sliver of pale silver moonlight. A heavy-set man slipped into the foyer. He wore dark, non-reflective tactical clothing and carried a massive steel canister of chemical accelerant. He moved with the quiet, practiced caution of a career criminal, stepping lightly onto the antique hardwood floor. He unscrewed the heavy cap of the canister, fully preparing to douse the vintage rugs and the expensive upholstery in flammable liquid. He never even had the chance to pour a single drop. Tariq struck from the absolute darkness with terrifying military-grade precision. He did not shout a warning or hesitate for a fraction of a second. He lunged violently forward, sweeping the arsonist's legs entirely out from under him while simultaneously seizing his right arm in a vice grip. The heavy steel canister clattered loudly against the floorboards, immediately spilling a harsh, toxic chemical scent into the enclosed air. Before the man could attempt to draw a concealed weapon or emit a panicked scream, Tariq drove him face first into the unyielding hardwood. He pinned the enforcer's arm high up his back at an excruciating angle designed specifically to shatter the bone if he offered any resistance. The man let out a muffled, desperate groan of pure agony, his face pressed flat against the floor. I calmly reached over to the side table and flipped the heavy switch on the brass reading lamp. The warm yellow light flooded the immediate area, harshly illuminating the stark violence of the scene. I stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored coat, and walked deliberately toward the man pinned to my floor. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic, angry monologue. True power never requires shouting. I pulled a sleek, high-capacity digital recording device from my interior breast pocket and placed it squarely on the polished coffee table directly beside his sweating face. The red recording indicator light blinked steadily, reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. I looked down at Silas, noting the rapid rise and fall of his chest, and the absolute, unadulterated panic dilating his pupils. I offered him a brutally simple, entirely non-negotiable ultimatum. He had exactly 2 options available to him in this life. Option 1 involved Tariq snapping his right arm in 3 distinct places before dragging him directly to the federal authorities. I possessed the legal and financial influence to ensure he would serve a minimum of 20 agonizing years in a maximum security penitentiary for attempted murder, felony arson, and criminal conspiracy. Option 2 required him to immediately surrender his unlocked mobile device and provide the exact unedited text messages and encrypted voice notes of Gavin formally ordering the destruction of my property. I leaned down, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I told him I did not care about his supposed street reputation, his criminal loyalties, or his fear of retaliation. I cared exclusively about destroying the man who had signed his paycheck. I gave him exactly 5 seconds to make a permanent life decision before Tariq applied the braking pressure. Silas did not require the full 5 seconds. The primal instinct for sheer self-preservation instantly overrides all arbitrary criminal codes. He choked out a desperate, panicked agreement, his voice cracking violently against the immense pressure Tariq applied directly to his spine. Tariq eased the agonizing tension just a fraction of an inch, allowing the man enough movement to reach into his tactical vest. Silas pulled out the heavy burner phone, punched in the 6-digit passcode with trembling, slick fingers, and slid the fully unlocked device across the polished floorboards until it hit the toe of my shoe. He chose immediate survival over Gavin's pathetic payout. Tariq immediately retrieved the unlocked device and connected it via a hardwire link to his secure, encrypted mobile terminal. He initiated a rapid, deeply aggressive download of the entire physical memory, mirroring the encrypted drives and hidden folders, directly to our secure offshore servers. He quickly isolated the specific audio files featuring Gavin's frantic, highly distinct voice, explicitly ordering the destruction of the property. The evidence of federal conspiracy and severe wire fraud was now absolutely mathematically irrefutable. But as the progress bar inched steadily toward completion, Tariq's eyes narrowed sharply at the glowing screen. He did not disconnect the device. He tapped on a hidden secondary messaging application buried deep within the phone's root directory, masked to look like a standard weather application. He looked up at me, his stoic expression hardening into cold, calculating disbelief. Gavin was not merely utilizing Silas to hire low-level street thugs for petty arson. He was using the enforcer as an untraceable encrypted middleman to coordinate massive, highly illegal financial wire transfers. Tariq rotated the screen toward me so I could clearly read the intercepted data. The text threads detailed a highly sophisticated money laundering operation, actively moving hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen investor capital through complex shell accounts. The final receiving party was not a construction vendor or a hostile criminal syndicate boss. The funds were being systematically and intentionally routed to a personal offshore luxury account registered to a woman named Cassandra. The encrypted data packet traveled from the recovered burner phone directly to Mitchell's secure servers in a matter of seconds. I sat in the oppressive silence of my study as the morning sun breached the horizon, watching the live forensic analysis unfold on my monitor. Mitchell did not require sleep. He required targets, and I had just provided him with a monumental vulnerability. Within 20 minutes, his aggressive background check completely dismantled the digital fortress surrounding the name we had extracted. The woman was not a shadowy cartel associate or an anonymous shell corporation director operating in a foreign jurisdiction. She was Cassandra Vance, the senior loan officer at the exact banking institution that had blindly approved Gavin's fraudulent $4 million mortgage. The revelation added a sickening, deeply personal layer to Gavin's corporate treason. He was actively maintaining a highly secretive, deeply volatile sexual affair with the woman directly responsible for processing his illegal loans. Gavin was sleeping with the gatekeeper to guarantee his forged documents bypassed standard federal scrutiny. He was using stolen investor capital to finance a mistress while simultaneously draining my daughter's financial future to keep up the charade of his commercial success. The absolute depravity of his betrayal severed any lingering shred of mercy I might have harbored for the man. He was weak, reckless, and entirely driven by base impulses. I transmitted Cassandra's home address, vehicle registration, and corporate itinerary directly to Tariq. The time for gathering peripheral intelligence was over. We needed the master ledger to close the jaws of the trap. Tariq executed the interception with the cold, unfeeling precision of a coordinated military strike. He tracked Cassandra to an exclusive high-security parking garage located directly beneath the city's financial district. The subterranean concrete cavern was cold and damp, echoing with the distant, muffled hum of city traffic above. Cassandra approached her pristine, imported luxury sedan, the expensive keys jingling softly in her manicured hand. She moved with the arrogant, untouchable confidence of a woman who believed her financial crimes were buried safely behind impenetrable corporate firewalls. Tariq did not emerge from the shadows with a weapon drawn. He did not issue a single verbal threat or raise his voice. He simply stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light, physically blocking her access to the driver's side door. Cassandra froze her breath, catching in her throat as she registered the lethal stillness radiating from the man standing in front of her. Tariq placed a pristine, unmarked manila folder flat against the polished hood of her expensive vehicle. He instructed her to open it. Cassandra hesitated, her eyes darting frantically toward the empty concrete exit ramp before her trembling fingers pulled back the heavy cardboard cover. The folder contained absolute, undeniable devastation. Tariq had printed high-definition time-stamped photographs of Cassandra and Gavin entering a rundown roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. Beneath the glossy, damning images lay a thick stack of printed digital traces. The paperwork meticulously documented every single illegal wire transfer moving directly from Gavin's bankrupt corporate accounts into her private offshore savings portfolio. Tariq watched her eyes widen in abject terror as she processed the fatal reality of her exposure. He informed her that the Federal Banking Commission would interpret these documents as a coordinated conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud and grand larceny. He told her she was staring at a minimum 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Cassandra physically swayed against the side of her luxury vehicle. Her arrogant, polished facade completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the suffocating primal panic of a trapped animal. She understood the ruthless, unforgiving mechanics of the financial world better than anyone. She knew the federal authorities would show her absolutely zero mercy, and she knew Gavin would instantly throw her to the wolves to save his own skin the moment the walls closed in. Tariq did not allow her a moment to catch her breath or formulate a defensive lie. He issued a single non-negotiable demand. He required the master ledger of Gavin's fraudulent applications. He wanted the original unedited loan documents, the phantom collateral reports, and the raw data proving Gavin had knowingly and willfully committed massive federal fraud using my forged signature. Cassandra looked at the pristine folder resting on her hood and then at the cold, unyielding face of my son. She realized her lucrative career, her freedom, and her entire life were completely compromised. She made the only logical choice a cornered predator can make in the wild. She instantly turned on her co-conspirator. Cassandra placed her shaking hands on the brass clasps of her designer briefcase. She snapped it open and reached deep into a hidden zippered interior compartment. She pulled out a sleek, heavy, encrypted flash drive. She held it out to Tariq, her voice cracking as she explicitly confirmed that every single forged document, fake appraisal, and illegal transfer Gavin had ever submitted was permanently stored on that drive. Tariq accepted the drive without a single word of gratitude. He turned his back on the weeping woman and vanished seamlessly back into the concrete shadows of the parking garage. 1 hour later, my son walked confidently through the heavy mahogany doors of Mitchell's downtown office. He tossed the encrypted flash drive directly onto the center of the expansive conference table. Mitchell inserted the drive into his secure terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard to bypass Cassandra's basic security protocols with practiced ease. The screen instantly flooded with thousands of raw, unedited financial documents exposing the absolute entirety of Gavin's massive criminal enterprise. Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. The trap was perfectly and irreversibly set. I stared at the glowing monitor, feeling the immense crushing weight of the evidence we had meticulously secured. I no longer just possessed the means to stop a demolition order or expose a failing toxic marriage. I now held the absolute power to legally annihilate Gavin. I held the keys to send him to a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. The drive back to the estate felt like a slow march toward the final battlefield. I pulled my sedan into the gravel circle, the familiar sight of the Grand Manor no longer evoking comfort, but rather a cold, tactical necessity. The house stood as a monument to the life I had built, a life currently being dismantled from within. I entered the kitchen through the side foyer, my footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. Kendra stood by the marble island, gesturing wildly with a designer tablet as she berated the head caterer over the choice of appetizers for her upcoming charity gala. Her voice was sharp-laced with the same condescending arrogance that Gavin wore like armor. She did not even look up as I crossed the room. I walked past her, the silence of my presence momentarily ignored, and moved to the coffee station. I poured a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in the quiet air. I watched her for a moment, observing the way she prioritized the status of her social event, while her husband orchestrated the destruction of my legacy. I took a slow, measured sip, allowed the heat to settle, and then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I asked her with a casual tone that belied the storm why she had authorized Gavin to fire the private investigator who had finally been closing the gap on her brother's trail. Kendra froze mid-sentence. The tablet clattered onto the granite counter. Her hand, which had been raised to emphasize a point about the floral arrangements, dropped to her side. The expensive porcelain mug she had been holding for her morning tea slipped from her grip. It struck the tiled floor with a violent crash, sending shards of white ceramic and steaming liquid spraying across the clean surface. She stared down at the mess, her chest heaving as she fought for a coherent response. Her eyes darted toward the hallway before snapping back to me. She immediately attempted to regain control, her voice trembling as she stammered a rehearsed justification. She claimed the investigator was nothing more than a common scammer, a man who had been feeding us false hope to continue bleeding our accounts dry. She insisted that she and Gavin had acted solely out of concern for my mental state, believing that clinging to a 30-year-old memory was damaging my health. I allowed her to finish the lie. I watched the frantic motion of her eyes as she searched for a path of least resistance. Without a word, I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I tapped the screen once, and the kitchen filled with a clear, crystalline recording. It was the private investigator's voice speaking to a legal assistant confirming that Kendra had met with him at his office 3 months ago. The audio detailed how she had personally signed an ironclad, aggressive non-disclosure agreement. She had paid him a substantial sum to terminate the case and to ensure he never uttered the name Tariq again. She had actively buried the search for her own brother. The audio file reached its conclusion, leaving the room in a heavy, suffocating silence. Kendra dropped the facade of the concerned daughter entirely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment. She began to scream, the sound grating against the high ceilings of the kitchen. She shouted that Tariq was nothing more than a ghost, a myth I had used to ignore the daughter who had actually stayed by my side for decades. She shrieked that she had earned every cent of the inheritance through the sheer effort of enduring my endless, pathetic grief. She paced her heels, clicking aggressively against the tile, blaming me for her lack of support, her lack of love, and her need to secure her future by any means necessary. I watched her disintegrate, seeing the entitlement that had defined her entire adult life. I did not move to silence her. I simply opened a folder I had retrieved from my study and slid a single bank document across the remaining clean space on the kitchen counter. It was a forensic financial trace mapped out by Mitchell with absolute clarity. The document tracked a series of rapid illegal fund transfers from Gavin's shell company directly into a private luxury account. It detailed how Gavin had completely emptied Kendra's personal trust fund, the nest egg she believed was her private safety net, to purchase a secret multi-million-dollar luxury condo for Cassandra. Kendra stopped screaming. She stared at the bank document, her mouth slightly agape as the implications shattered her reality. She traced the numbers, recognizing her own account details being bled dry for the benefit of another woman. The absolute, calculated betrayal of her husband crushed her pride in a single heartbeat. Her arrogance vanished, replaced by the hollow, vacant look of someone who had gambled everything on a lie. She looked up at me, her hands shaking as she tried to comprehend the depth of Gavin's deceit. I did not offer her comfort. I did not validate her pain. I turned my back on the broken porcelain and the crumbling woman, leaving her standing alone in the debris of her own life. Gavin burst through the front door of the estate a few hours later, the heavy oak slamming shut with a violent, echoing thud. I sat quietly in my study with the door intentionally left ajar, listening closely to his erratic, heavy footsteps pacing the marble foyer. The polished, charismatic veneer he wore so carefully for his high society peers was completely obliterated. He was sweating profusely, loosening his expensive silk tie with jerky, uncoordinated movements. The absolute silence from his criminal operatives was tearing his nerves to shreds. Silas, the arsonist he had hired to burn down my guest house, had vanished without a single trace into the pitch-black night. Cassandra, his illicit offshore banker and mistress, had completely stopped answering his frantic, heavily encrypted messages. He was entirely blind, cut off from his vital criminal lifelines, and the massive, suffocating weight of the $4 million offshore loan was crushing his chest. Desperation inevitably breeds spectacular mistakes. I watched through the narrow opening as he ushered a second man into the hallway. The newcomer carried a worn black leather medical bag and wore an ill-fitting suit beneath a pristine white coat. Gavin had initiated his final desperate contingency plan. If he could not burn my properties to claim the rapid insurance payout, and he could not reach his banker to secure the fraudulent funds he needed immediate, unchallenged legal control over my entire estate, he intended to establish absolute legal guardianship by having me officially declared mentally incompetent. Gavin marched down the long corridor and pushed open my study door without bothering to knock. He forced a wide, remarkably unstable smile across his flushed face. He announced loudly that he had taken the liberty of bringing a private concierge physician to the house for a routine blood pressure check claiming my recent emotional stress over Tariq required immediate, professional medical attention. He gestured for the corrupt doctor to step inside my private sanctuary. I did not object to the blatant intrusion. I simply closed the active file on my desk and calmly invited the man to take a seat. The doctor sat heavily in the leather chair opposite my mahogany desk. He did not introduce himself or ask how I was feeling. He pulled a small pen light and a blood pressure cuff from his bag with dismissive, practiced apathy. He leaned forward and began asking me basic, aggressively condescending cognitive questions. He spoke to me in a slow, excessively loud cadence, treating me as if I were a confused toddler rather than the architect of a national logistics empire. He asked me to identify the current day of the week, the name of the sitting president, and to count backward from 100 by intervals of 7. He was laying the superficial, fraudulent groundwork for a devastating medical diagnosis. I did not blink. I locked my eyes directly onto his and answered every single question with terrifying, razor-sharp precision. I did not stop at simply reciting the date. I effortlessly detailed the exact closing figures of the Dow Jones Industrial Average from the previous afternoon, cross-referencing them against global shipping yields and current international trade deficits. When he attempted to physically measure my pulse, I systematically corrected his flawed medical terminology regarding systolic pressure variations. I leaned across the polished wood and recited a dense, highly specialized paragraph regarding cardiovascular health and age-related vascular elasticity, specifically citing the complex medical journals he had undoubtedly ignored since his days in medical school. My mind was an impenetrable vault, and I let him feel the absolute crushing weight of my intellect. The doctor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a thick bead of sweat forming on his brow. My flawless cognitive display actively dismantled the false narrative he was paid to construct. Gavin hovered nervously near the doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, realizing the medical examination was failing spectacularly. The doctor decided to abandon the charade entirely. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pre-filled prescription pad. He ignored my precise answers and aggressively pushed the paper across my desk. He claimed I was exhibiting severe signs of acute paranoia and aggressive verbal agitation. He stated that I required an immediate heavy regimen of industrial-grade sedatives to stabilize my supposedly declining mental state. The prescription was the absolute key to Gavin's master plan. If I took the sedatives, I would become genuinely incapacitated, allowing Gavin to legally seize control of my fortune by the end of the week. I looked at the blue prescription slip resting on the dark mahogany wood. I did not touch the paper. I did not raise my voice in protest or demand a second medical opinion. I reached into my top drawer and pulled out my digital tablet. I tapped the screen once, waking the device, and slid it smoothly across the desk until it rested directly over his forged medical document. The screen displayed a pristine, high-definition live video feed. The corrupt doctor looked down. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. The video clearly showed Silas, the heavy-set arsonist Gavin had hired the previous night. Silas was sitting inside a sterile, brightly lit interrogation room at the downtown federal precinct. He was speaking frantically to a pair of seasoned federal detectives, actively downloading the entire contents of his burner phone directly into their evidence database. The arsonist was confessing to every single detail of the criminal conspiracy, explicitly trading Gavin's freedom for his own survival. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, bringing my face inches from the trembling physician. I lowered my voice to a cold, lethal whisper that only he could hear. I explicitly stated the exact sum of $25,000. It was the precise hidden amount Gavin had wired to the doctor's offshore shell account yesterday afternoon to purchase the falsified incompetency report. I informed him that the federal detectives currently listening to the arsonist already possessed the complete master ledger of Gavin's financial transactions. They were actively tracking every single bribe, every offshore transfer, and every corrupt medical professional tied to the failing real estate developer. I told him he was not conducting a private house call. He was actively participating in a heavily monitored federal crime. The doctor's breathing stopped completely. The sheer reality of a federal wire fraud indictment crushed his arrogant demeanor into absolute dust. He looked from the live video feed of the confessing criminal directly into my cold, unyielding eyes. He realized he had walked willingly into an inescapable legal slaughterhouse. Absolute primal panic seized his nervous system. He did not say a single word to me or attempt to retrieve his forged prescription slip. He violently shoved his chair backward, the wooden leg screeching harshly against the polished floorboards. He grabbed his worn black medical bag with shaking hands, abandoning his pen light and medical instruments directly on my desk. The doctor sprinted toward the door, roughly shoving his way past a completely bewildered Gavin. Gavin shouted his name, demanding to know where he was going and what the official diagnosis was. The physician ignored him entirely. He practically tore the heavy front door off its hinges as he sprinted toward his vehicle, his tires squealing loudly as he fled the estate in absolute terror. I remained seated behind my desk, folding my hands together in quiet, absolute satisfaction. I looked at my son-in-law standing isolated in the doorway of my study. His final, desperate lifeline had just evaporated into the morning air, leaving him entirely exposed. The spectacular failure of the medical ambush left Gavin completely devoid of options. His meticulously constructed legal avenues were collapsing simultaneously, burning to ash alongside his discarded contingencies. He could not claim the insurance money from an arson attempt that never happened. He could not seize my estate with a fraudulent medical decree that was actively sitting in a federal evidence locker. The walls were closing in with terrifying speed, and the crushing weight of his $4 million offshore debt demanded immediate substantial appeasement. A cornered animal acts purely on primal survival instinct. Gavin required a massive injection of untraceable capital, and he required it before his fragile web of lies detonated completely. He made his final desperate move. He bypassed his own logistical planners, ignored his caterers' protests, and aggressively pushed the massive groundbreaking gala for his luxury development forward by a full 24 hours. The event, originally scheduled for Friday evening, was violently rescheduled to Thursday night. He sent frantic, urgent communications to his wealthy blind investors, claiming the accelerated timeline was an exclusive celebration of unprecedented early progress. It was a thinly veiled, pathetic excuse to lock them in a room, dazzle them with cheap champagne and superficial grandiosity, and extract their capital contributions before the federal authorities inevitably froze his accounts. He was racing against a clock he could not see, entirely unaware that I controlled the hands. I monitored his frantic digital communications from the quiet safety of my estate. His panic was a palpable living entity, radiating through every intercepted email and rushed venue deposit. He believed the gala was his ultimate salvation. He believed he could secure the funds and outrun his own shadow. Tariq and I relocated from the estate to the sterile, high-tech environment of Mitchell's downtown conference room. The polished mahogany table was covered in projected financial schematics, risk assessments, and live corporate ledgers. We were no longer playing defense against a desperate man. We were initiating a devastating, highly calculated, hostile corporate takeover. Gavin had legally contracted a massive, reputable construction firm named Apex Builders to execute the physical development of his fraudulent luxury project. Apex was the absolute foundation of his entire operation, the sole legitimate entity giving his phantom blueprints a veneer of credibility to his investors. Mitchell had spent the last 48 hours mapping Apex's specific market vulnerabilities. The firm was severely over-leveraged on several massive municipal contracts, making their stock highly susceptible to an aggressive buyout. I possessed vast hidden liquid assets, the accumulated wealth of a lifetime spent mastering international logistics and ruthless corporate negotiation. I authorized Mitchell to deploy those funds without a single moment of hesitation. We moved quietly and with overwhelming financial force. Through a complex, untraceable network of offshore holding companies and proxy investors, we systematically purchased every available share of Apex Builders on the open market. When the public shares were completely exhausted, Mitchell ruthlessly targeted the private board members. He offered them immediate cash buyouts at staggering premiums they simply could not refuse. The acquisitions happened simultaneously, a synchronized financial strike designed specifically to bypass regulatory alarms until the absolute final moment. Tariq stood by the monitors tracking the real-time data flow as equity shifted rapidly from scattered investors directly into my primary holding account. We dismantled Apex's corporate sovereignty in less than 4 hours. Gavin's entire development rested completely on the shoulders of a company he believed was an independent, subcontracted entity. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had just been fundamentally altered. He was actively preparing to host a multi-million-dollar gala to fund a construction project that he no longer had the legal authority or the physical means to execute. The corporate strike was absolute, surgical, and completely devastating. Mitchell tapped the final keystroke on his secure terminal and reached for the heavy leather binder resting at his side. He opened it, revealing the pristine, finalized acquisition documents. The dense legal text represented the total capitulation of Apex Builders and the flawless execution of our financial siege. Mitchell slid the heavy paper across the polished mahogany desk, positioning a gold-plated fountain pen perfectly parallel to the signature line. He looked up, his face a mask of supreme professional satisfaction. I leaned forward in the high-backed leather chair. For decades, I had played the role of the quiet, retiring patriarch, allowing Gavin to drastically underestimate my physical and mental capabilities. I picked up the heavy pen with my right hand. My grip was rock solid, completely devoid of the fabricated tremors I had used to lure him into a false sense of superiority. I pressed the gold nib against the thick paper and signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes, establishing my absolute legal authority over the entity. The ink dried in seconds, legally sealing the transition of power. I was now the unquestioned owner and the majority shareholder of the exact construction company Gavin had contracted to build his fraudulent empire. Every blueprint, every piece of heavy machinery, every active municipal permit, and every single construction worker assigned to his luxury project now answered exclusively to me. Gavin's entire future, his desperately needed salvation, and his fabricated commercial legacy were completely owned by the man he had actively attempted to destroy. He was a tenant standing on property I fully controlled, holding a lease I was about to incinerate. The financial noose was complete. Mitchell watched the ink dry before smoothly closing the heavy leather folder. The sharp snap of the clasp echoed loudly in the quiet, temperature-controlled conference room. The financial net was perfectly and irreversibly tightened around Gavin's throat. There were no secondary contingencies left for him to exploit, no hidden escape routes left to discover, and no accomplices left to manipulate. His entire fraudulent existence, his career and his freedom, were securely contained within the binding of the documents resting on that desk. I placed the gold pen down and stood up slowly from the leather chair. I reached down and methodically adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, smoothing the dark fabric with absolute calculated precision. I turned my attention to Tariq, who stood by the expansive glass window, looking out over the fading city skyline. The time for operating in the shadows, tracing offshore accounts, and intercepting burner phones had officially ended. We had successfully isolated the target, severed his criminal lifelines, and purchased his battlefield out from under him. I looked directly at my son, my voice steady, cold, and completely devoid of mercy. I informed Tariq that it was time to attend a gala. I returned to the estate as the evening shadows began to stretch across the manicured lawns. The heavy oak doors of my home offered a brief, deceptive quiet before the final storm broke. I stood in the main hallway, adjusting the cuffs of my evening shirt, preparing for the gala that would serve as Gavin's public execution. The heavy thud of tires grinding against the gravel driveway shattered the calm. Seconds later, the front door violently crashed open, rebounding against the wall with a sickening crack. Gavin stormed into the foyer. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant developer who had paraded through my home for the past 3 years. His expensive silk tie hung loose and jagged around his neck. His tailored shirt was heavily wrinkled and soaked with sweat beneath the arms. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the space with a manic, unhinged desperation. He had run completely out of time, and the suffocating pressure of his imminent financial collapse had finally fractured his sanity. He charged directly toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor. In his right hand, he wildly waved a sheaf of crumpled legal documents, the pages snapping sharply in the quiet air. He did not bother with false pleasantries or his usual venomous sarcasm. He shouted that the games were completely over. He slapped the documents hard against the entryway console aggressively, pointing a trembling finger at the bold, heavily stamped ink on the top page. It was a fraudulent court order, rushed through a corrupt municipal judge he still had on his payroll, granting him immediate emergency medical guardianship over my person. He had bypassed the standard psychiatric evaluation, entirely using sheer bribery to secure a counterfeit legal decree. Gavin stood inches from my face, his breath reeking of stale alcohol and pure panic. He loudly declared that he had secured immediate, absolute eviction rights over the entire property. He claimed the court order granted him total jurisdiction over my medical and physical well-being, effectively stripping me of my autonomy. He pointed aggressively toward the grand staircase and ordered me to walk up to my bedroom and pack a single small overnight bag. He stated with vicious, trembling satisfaction that a secure medical transport van was already en route. He claimed the vehicle would arrive in exactly 1 hour to forcefully relocate me to a state-run psychiatric facility on the absolute fringe of the county. He detailed how the order legally barred me from contacting my lawyers, accessing my financial accounts, or stepping foot on my own estate ever again. He was attempting to physically remove me from the board before the Thursday night gala, hoping to seize my physical assets the moment I was locked behind a ward door. I shifted my gaze past his sweating, frantic face and looked toward the archway leading to the formal dining room. Kendra stood motionless in the deep shadows. She had followed him inside, but she completely lacked the aggressive fire that usually accompanied her husband's schemes. She looked absolutely hollow. She knew the truth about Cassandra. She knew Gavin had completely drained her personal trust fund to purchase a luxury condominium for his mistress. Yet she stood there in the background staring blankly at the polished marble floor. She refused to intervene. She refused to speak a single word of defense on my behalf, and she absolutely refused to meet my eyes. The reality of her husband's absolute betrayal had crushed her arrogance, but it had not ignited her loyalty. She was still choosing the cowardly path, silently allowing Gavin to execute his violent, fraudulent coup simply because she lacked the moral spine to stop him. Her silence was the final, definitive answer to decades of my misplaced paternal hope. I looked back at Gavin, feeling absolutely nothing for the trembling, desperate criminal standing in my foyer. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to snatch the fraudulent court order from the consul or argue the legal technicalities of his fabricated medical decree. The time for engaging in Gavin's pathetic, desperate illusions had officially expired. I simply reached down and calmly buttoned the front of my tailored suit jacket, my movements slow, deliberate, and completely unaffected by his frantic screaming. I looked directly into his manic, bloodshot eyes. I informed him in a voice as cold and unyielding as glacial ice that his eviction notice was completely invalid. I explained that the paper he was aggressively waving in the air was absolutely worthless, carrying zero legal weight over the ground he was currently standing on. Gavin let out a harsh, incredulous bark of laughter. The sheer stress of the moment completely overrode whatever basic survival instincts he had left. He sneered violently, stepping directly into my personal space, closing the distance until his chest nearly brushed against mine. He demanded to know exactly how a supposedly senile, isolated old man intended to fight a municipal court order. He aggressively asked what invisible army I believed I possessed. He shouted that my lawyers were miles away. My physical strength was gone, and my own daughter had completely abandoned me to the wolves. He raised his hand, pointing a rigid finger directly at my chest, and demanded to know exactly who was going to walk through my front door and stop him from throwing me out into the street. The heavy oak front door swung open behind him. The brass hinges groaned loudly against the sudden forceful movement, instantly cutting through the echoing remnants of Gavin's arrogant shouting. The cool evening breeze swept into the stifling tension of the foyer, carrying the distinct scent of impending ruin. Tariq walked deliberately into the entryway. He did not rush, nor did he display a single trace of hesitation. He moved with the terrifying, predatory stillness of a man who had already won the war. He stopped exactly 3 feet behind Gavin's rigid back. Gavin slowly turned around, the triumphant sneer completely freezing on his face as he registered the sheer imposing physical presence blocking his only exit. He stared at the stranger, completely unable to process the immediate threat. Tariq looked directly at Gavin with cold, dead eyes. He did not offer an introduction or an explanation. He simply looked at the desperate, sweating man and delivered the final, crushing blow. The legal owner of this property. Gavin physically recoiled as if struck by a massive, unseen force. His expensive leather shoes slipped awkwardly against the polished marble floor, sending him staggering backward until his shoulder violently slammed into the heavy oak console table. A decorative bronze lamp teetered wildly before crashing to the ground, the sharp noise puncturing the thick, suffocating silence of my foyer. From the deep shadows of the adjoining dining room, a piercing, visceral scream ripped through the air. Kendra stepped forward into the light, her eyes wide with an absolute, unadulterated terror that completely stripped away her usual veneer of haughty entitlement. The expensive smartphone she had been clutching slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the hardwood with a sharp crack that shattered the glass screen. She stared at the imposing figure blocking the doorway, her mind violently rejecting the reality standing right in front of her. The brother she had systematically paid to erase the phantom she had aggressively buried under layers of expensive non-disclosure agreements and ruthless legal threats was standing in her own foyer. Tariq did not look like a ghost or a distant fading memory. He looked like a lethal, highly calculated executioner, radiating an aura of absolute control that instantly sucked all the oxygen from the room. He did not say a single word to his sister. He simply allowed the heavy, crushing weight of his physical presence to pin her to the floor. The sheer shock of his resurrection paralyzed them both, turning their arrogant coup into a pathetic, transparent farce. I watched Gavin gasp for air, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to reconcile the impossible entity standing before him with the fraudulent eviction papers still clutched tightly in his sweating hand. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. Tariq did not offer a warm family reunion, nor did he acknowledge the pathetic, shattered remnants of his sister's composure. He moved past the threshold with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. Reaching into the inner pocket of his dark tactical jacket, he withdrew a thick, pristine legal folder secured with a heavy brass clasp. He walked deliberately toward the center of the foyer and tossed the folder directly onto the debris-covered console table right beside Gavin's crumpled eviction notice. Tariq instructed Gavin to look at the paperwork. He did not shout. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that commanded absolute, immediate obedience. Gavin's trembling hands reached for the folder, his fingers fumbling awkwardly with the clasp before pulling out a stack of heavy, watermarked documents. Tariq systematically dismantled the foundation of Gavin's entire criminal enterprise in 3 brutal sentences. He presented the original officially notarized deed to the historical estate. He pointed a steady finger at the bold, undeniable legal seal stamped across the bottom of the primary page. The document explicitly and irrefutably proved that I had legally transferred the absolute ownership of the property and all its associated assets into a highly secure, impenetrable blind trust exactly 10 years ago. I watched Tariq direct Gavin's panicked eyes to the signature line, assigning the sole executorship of that precise trust. The name Tariq Vance was printed in crisp black ink. Tariq stepped closer, forcing my son-in-law to absorb the lethal reality of his situation. He explained that the specific deed Gavin had illegally procured from the county records, the same document he had ruthlessly forged to secure his $4 million offshore loan, was nothing more than a completely useless, outdated photocopy. It held absolutely zero legal weight in any jurisdiction on the planet. Gavin had effectively pledged a phantom asset to a syndicate of ruthless offshore creditors. He had committed massive, easily provable federal wire fraud using a piece of paper that was functionally worth less than the ink it was printed with. Tariq watched the blood drain entirely from Gavin's face, knowing the developer now understood the catastrophic magnitude of his error. He did not own the estate, he never had. He had built his entire financial salvation on a foundation of quicksand, and my son had just triggered the collapse. Gavin's mind violently fractured under the crushing, unbearable weight of his absolute failure. The realization that his complex, multi-million-dollar fraud had been meticulously outmaneuvered by a man he believed was dead stripped away his final shreds of rational thought. Driven by pure blinded panic and the suffocating terror of his impending ruin, he let out a guttural, desperate roar. Gavin lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into a wildly uncoordinated physical attack aimed directly at Tariq's throat. It was the pathetic thrashing strike of a drowning man completely devoid of tactical discipline. Tariq did not even flinch. I watched him react with terrifying, instantaneous military precision. He casually swatted Gavin's leading arm away, parrying the desperate strike with a fluid, dismissive block that completely shattered Gavin's forward momentum. In the exact same fraction of a second, Tariq stepped deep into the developer's guard, seizing his wrist in a crushing, unyielding vice grip. He brutally twisted the arm high up between Gavin's shoulder blades, locking the joint at an excruciating angle that threatened to snap the bone with a single millimeter of added pressure. Tariq drove his massive shoulder forward, slamming Gavin face first into the heavy oak paneling of the hallway wall. The violent impact knocked the remaining breath from Gavin's lungs, replacing his aggressive roar with a pathetic, wheezing gasp. He lay pinned helplessly against the woodwork, entirely immobilized, his expensive suit tearing at the seam. Tariq held him there effortlessly, a stone monolith pressing a fragile glass ornament to the breaking point. The illusion of Gavin's physical and corporate superiority was completely eradicated, reduced to a trembling, defeated mess pressed hard against the architecture of the house he had tried to steal from my family. Tariq leaned in close, pressing his cheek directly against the side of Gavin's sweating, trembling face. He did not raise his voice to match the violence of the physical altercation. Instead, he lowered it to a razor-sharp, chilling whisper that sliced directly into Gavin's ear, loud enough for me to hear every syllable in the quiet foyer. He informed the cornered developer that Cassandra's offshore banking syndicate had just issued an emergency recall on the fraudulent accounts. The volatile, heavily leveraged $4 million loan was no longer pending a monthly review. The ruthless creditors were officially calling the entire principal balance due at exactly midnight. Gavin had less than 3 hours to produce a phantom sum of liquid cash before extremely dangerous men began hunting him in the physical world. Tariq abruptly released his crushing grip and stepped back, letting gravity take over. Gavin crumpled to the marble floor, gasping for air, his eyes rolling in absolute terror. He scrambled frantically onto his hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing pain in his shoulder, and sprinted wildly down the corridor toward his private office to desperately check his imploding financial terminals. Tariq watched him run, standing tall in my home, the countdown to midnight officially activated. The sharp click of Gavin's private office door slamming shut down the hall left a ringing heavy vacuum in the grand foyer. Kendra remained frozen for a fraction of a second, her wide eyes darting between my impassive face and the imposing, statuesque presence of her resurrected brother. The devastating reality of her absolute, irreversible ruin finally severed the fragile, arrogant strings holding her together. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, the sharp impact of her knees echoing harshly through the vast vaulted space. The haughty, untouchable socialite vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, weeping shell of a woman. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, the fabric of her designer evening gown bunching awkwardly around her legs. She reached out with trembling, desperate fingers to grasp my hand, her manicured nails digging fiercely into my skin. She wept with a hysterical, choking intensity, a torrent of tears ruining her immaculate, expensive makeup. Throwing her head back, she looked up at me with pleading, bloodshot eyes and launched into a frantic, disjointed monologue of sheer self-preservation. She vehemently claimed that she knew absolutely nothing about the true depth of Gavin's financial depravity or the criminal arson plot. She shrieked that she was merely a victim of his relentless, calculated manipulation, a hostage trapped inside a marriage built entirely on psychological coercion and fear. She blamed her husband for every single betrayal, swearing that Gavin had forced her to sign the fraudulent banking documents, forced her to isolate me from my peers, and forced her to participate in the plot to seize the estate through a medical coup. She painted a pathetic, desperate portrait of her own innocence, begging for my forgiveness, pleading for me to protect her from the federal authorities and the impending, suffocating poverty. She squeezed my hand tighter, sobbing heavily that she was still my little girl, still the daughter I had chosen to raise and love with everything I had. I did not feel a single flicker of paternal warmth. I felt only the icy, absolute clarity of a man who had finally excised a terminal, rotting infection from his life. I stepped backward with deliberate, mechanical precision, forcibly breaking her physical hold on my hand. Her fingers fell empty to the polished marble floor. I looked down at the weeping woman, refusing to offer even a sliver of comfort or absolution. I dismantled her pathetic narrative of victimhood with chilling, surgical precision. I reminded her that Gavin did not hold a weapon to her head when she voluntarily drove her imported luxury car to that private investigator's office 3 months ago. I detailed the exact moment she sat across a polished desk and willingly, eagerly signed a legally binding, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She had not been manipulated into burying the search for Tariq. She had aggressively engineered it. She had actively paid a substantial cash bribe to permanently erase her own brother from existence, terrified that his rightful return would divide her unearned inheritance. I explicitly laid bare the dark, rotting mechanics of her moral bankruptcy. She had willingly traded her soul, her family, and every ounce of her humanity for a superficial lifestyle entirely financed by stolen capital and forged legal documents. She had blindly accepted the luxury cars, the lavish charity galas, and the exclusive designer wardrobe, never once questioning the origin of the funds because she simply did not care who had to be destroyed to maintain her fabricated status. She had watched Gavin actively plot to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked inside a sterile psychiatric ward, and she had stood by in calculated silence, eagerly waiting to inherit the spoils of my institutionalization. I leaned down slightly, ensuring my steady, unyielding voice penetrated the hysterical cadence of her sobbing. I told her she was not a victim of a manipulative husband or a hostage of tragic, unforeseen circumstances. She was the willing, enthusiastic architect of her own destruction. She had nurtured the greed within her own heart until it consumed her entirely. I told her she was exactly the monster she had consciously chosen to be. The heavy silence following my verdict was suddenly shattered by a primal, guttural scream erupting from the far end of the hallway. The sound was raw, filled with the absolute agonizing terror of a man watching his entire existence burn to ash in real time. The heavy oak door of the private study was violently thrown open, crashing backward against the drywall with a deafening thud. Gavin sprinted back into the foyer. He looked entirely deranged. His face was flushed crimson, his breathing ragged, shallow, and rapid. The offshore creditors had not just called the $4 million loan due, they had executed a lethal, automated financial protocol. His offshore accounts were completely irreversibly frozen. He shrieked wildly that his secure banking terminals were locked out behind a flashing red warning screen. A federal notification had popped up on his primary monitor, officially informing him that the FBI had flagged his entire corporate network for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. The financial trap Tariq and I had meticulously set had snapped shut with bone-crushing force, severing his access to a single dime. Gavin's eyes darted wildly around the room, full of paranoid terror, before locking onto Kendra, who was still kneeling on the marble floor. The last remaining threads of their unified aristocratic front instantly dissolved into pure vitriolic hatred. He lunged toward her, his voice cracking as he screamed directly into her face. He blamed her for his absolute ruin. He viciously stated that she was supposed to manage her pathetic senile father and keep the estate secure. He shouted that her failure to secure my signature, her failure to properly execute the medical guardianship, and her sheer overwhelming incompetence had brought this federal devastation directly to his doorstep. He blamed her arrogance for bringing Tariq into their lives, stating her greed had blinded them both to the trap closing around their throats. The toxic marriage violently imploded right in front of me, shattering into 1,000 jagged, venomous pieces. They screamed at each other, their hostile voices echoing harshly off the vaulted ceiling, trading vicious insults and desperate, panicked accusations as the crushing reality of federal prison and absolute poverty closed in around them. They were two parasitic entities fundamentally incapable of loyalty or love, actively tearing each other apart to avoid facing the brutal consequences of their own boundless greed. I did not need to issue another threat or deliver a final, dramatic parting word. The punishment I had engineered was now entirely self-sustaining. I turned my gaze to Tariq. My son stood perfectly still beside the heavy console table, his stoic, commanding presence serving as an impenetrable shield against the pathetic chaos erupting in the foyer. We exchanged a single, silent look of absolute understanding. The war was officially over. The estate was secure, the enemy was legally and financially annihilated, and the lingering ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. I turned my back on the screaming couple, stepped out through the heavy front doors, and walked into the cool, quiet night. The digital warning flashing across his computer monitors should have been the definitive end of Gavin's illusions. The bright red banner declaring his accounts frozen by federal authorities was an inescapable death sentence for his career and his freedom. Yet a man who has spent his entire adult life surviving entirely on manufactured confidence and stolen prestige is fundamentally incapable of accepting absolute defeat. Gavin simply closed the heavy mahogany doors of his study, actively shutting out the hysterical, echoing screams of his wife in the hallway. He chose to entirely compartmentalize the looming reality of a federal indictment. His pathological arrogance convinced him that the walls were not actually closing in, but merely shifting to provide him a new, narrower path to victory. He walked into his dressing room with a terrifying, manic calm. He meticulously prepared for the evening, shedding his sweat-soaked, ruined clothes for a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo. Every adjustment of his silk bow tie and every brush of his manicured hair was a deliberate reinforcement of his own delusion. He was absolutely determined to host the massive, groundbreaking gala that he had so violently pushed forward. He did not care that the construction company was entirely owned by my family or that his offshore funds were locked in a federal vault. He believed with absolute unwavering certainty that his unparalleled charisma was his ultimate weapon. His plan was exceptionally simple and entirely rooted in madness. He intended to stand before the city's most elite blind investors, dazzle them with his practiced charm, and extract millions in untraceable liquid cash deposits before the end of the night. He genuinely believed he could secure the Capitol walk out the back door of the venue and board an international flight before the FBI even drafted the physical arrest warrant. The grand ballroom of the city's premier downtown hotel was a masterclass in superficial opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of attendees. Waitstaff in pristine white coats circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and imported delicacies. The room was packed wall to wall with the absolute apex of the municipal elite. Influential local politicians, heavy-hitting venture capitalists, and eager real estate moguls mingled freely, completely unaware that they were attending a celebration of a phantom empire. The atmosphere was charged with the electric hum of anticipated wealth. The stage at the front of the room was dominated by a colossal high-definition digital screen currently displaying the sleek, minimalist logo of Gavin's development firm. Gavin stood in the wings, adjusting his cuffs one final time before stepping out into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The applause was immediate and thunderous. He walked to the center of the stage, radiating an aura of total, unshakable confidence. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, bowing his head slightly in a practiced display of false humility. When he looked up, his smile was brilliant, disarming, and completely devoid of the manic terror that had consumed him just a few hours prior. He began to speak, his voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. He delivered a masterful, highly emotional speech meticulously designed to separate the wealthy audience from their capital. He spoke passionately about the future of urban innovation, weaving grandiose promises of sustainable luxury with calculated appeals to civic pride. He seamlessly invoked the concept of family legacy, subtly implying that his development was a continuation of my own life's work, actively leveraging the pristine reputation he had so desperately tried to steal from me. He asked the audience to trust his vision to invest not just in a building, but in a revolution of modern architecture. His delivery was flawless. He played their greed perfectly, manipulating their desire to be on the ground floor of an exclusive historic opportunity. He paused at all the right moments, allowing the weight of his promises to settle over the silent, captivated room. He gestured toward the crowd, locking eyes with key investors, personally assuring them that their massive contributions were the cornerstone of this unprecedented progress. He painted a vivid, breathtaking picture of the luxury towers that would supposedly redefine the city skyline, ensuring every person in that ballroom felt privileged simply to be invited. He was conducting a symphony of lies, and the audience was completely spellbound, hanging on his every fabricated word. Gavin reached the carefully orchestrated climax of his address. He raised his right hand in a grand, sweeping gesture, dramatically signaling for the technical crew to illuminate the massive presentation screen behind him. He announced that he was about to unveil the exclusive, high-resolution digital renderings of the luxury development, the final visual push required to secure their immediate financial commitments. The ballroom lights dimmed perfectly on cue. A hushed, collective silence fell over the elite crowd as they turned their attention to the colossal display. The screen went entirely black for a fraction of a second. Then it flickered violently, emitting a harsh, disruptive visual tear across the display. The pristine architectural renderings of glass towers and manicured rooftop gardens did not appear. Instead, the massive projector illuminated the room with a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph. It was a surveillance image of Gavin, clearly recognizable in his signature gray suit, walking through the cheap, neon-lit doorway of a roadside motel. His arm was wrapped intimately around the waist of Cassandra, his illicit offshore banker. Before the audience could even process the scandalous image, the screen flashed again. The display shifted to present a series of highly classified internal bank ledgers. The documents were magnified and highlighted with bright yellow markers explicitly detailing the direct unauthorized transfer of millions of dollars of investor funds out of the municipal construction accounts and directly into Cassandra's private, untraceable shell corporations. Every single date, timestamp, and routing number was displayed in undeniable massive print. The exact capital these investors had already contributed to the project was actively being tracked on the screen as it funneled directly into Gavin's pockets to finance his exorbitant personal debts and his hidden mistress. A collective visceral gasp of unified horror ripped through the grand ballroom. The sound of hundreds of wealthy, powerful individuals simultaneously realizing they were the victims of a massive financial slaughter echoed loudly against the crystal chandeliers. Several prominent investors shoved their chairs backward, the heavy wooden legs screeching violently against the polished floorboards. Gavin froze behind the acrylic podium, the color draining entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He frantically slapped the console, desperately waving his arms at the technical booth in the back of the room, silently screaming for them to cut the power to the projector. He leaned into the microphone to salvage his crumbling reality, but before a single word could escape his lips, the audio system emitted a sharp, ear-piercing burst of heavy static. The microphone cut out completely, plunging his voice into absolute silence. The high-definition evidence of his federal crimes remained glowing brightly above his head, casting a harsh, condemning light over his trembling frame. The polite elite gathering instantly fractured. Furious shouts erupted from the front row as venture capitalists demanded their money. The ballroom descended into absolute, uncontrollable chaos. Gavin slammed his fist repeatedly against the acrylic podium, the sharp, desperate cracks echoing beneath the rising roar of the outraged crowd. He gripped the dead microphone, his knuckles turning stark white as he screamed into the useless metal, frantically ordering the technical crew to sever the power to the massive display. He shouted for the venue security to manually drop the projection screen, but his hoarse voice was entirely swallowed by the deafening waves of panic sweeping through the grand ballroom. High above him, the undeniable digital evidence of his massive federal wire fraud remained brightly illuminated, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on his pale, sweating face. The audiovisual booth remained completely unresponsive, locked down from the inside by Mitchell's hired operatives hours before the event even began. Gavin was completely isolated on the illuminated stage, visibly trembling as the polished veneer of his multi-million-dollar empire disintegrated into absolute nothingness in front of the city's elite. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, violent crash. The thick wood slammed against the decorative brass stoppers with enough force to fracture the surrounding plaster, sending a massive shockwave of sound that instantly commanded the attention of the hysterical room. The agitated crowd near the main entrance parted instinctively, creating a wide, silent path down the center aisle. I walked slowly into the brilliant light of the venue. I did not rush my steps. I moved with the calm, measured authority of a man stepping confidently onto a battlefield he had already comprehensively conquered. Tariq walked deliberately by my right side, his posture rigidly straight, exuding total predatory control over the environment. Attorney Mitchell flanked my left, carrying his signature dark leather briefcase containing the absolute proof of Gavin's ruin. The frantic murmurs of the wealthy investors died down rapidly as they turned to watch us approach. The true architect of this destruction had finally arrived. I stopped exactly 10 feet from the edge of the elevated stage, planting my feet firmly onto the plush carpet. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, suspended in a thick, suffocating tension. I did not require a microphone to command the vast room. Decades of ruthless corporate negotiation had taught me exactly how to project my voice with lethal, resonant authority. I addressed the stunned elite investors directly, my tone entirely devoid of sympathy for their misplaced capital. I announced my true identity to the paralyzed crowd. I formally introduced myself as the primary controlling shareholder and absolute legal owner of Apex Builders, the sole legitimate construction firm Gavin had supposedly contracted for this massive luxury development. The collective shock rippling through the wealthy financiers was palpable. They realized instantly that the fundamental physical foundation of their investment had just been violently ripped away. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the terrified developer trembling behind the podium, ensuring he felt the full crushing weight of my words. I informed the silent audience that the man standing on the stage was a complete fraud, an architectural illusionist aggressively selling them empty air. I explicitly laid out the irrefutable facts of his sweeping deception. I stated clearly that Gavin did not own the municipal development property. I gestured toward my son standing beside me and declared that the historical estate and all its surrounding acreage belonged exclusively to Tariq through an ironclad blind trust. I then reiterated that the construction company responsible for laying the physical steel and concrete belonged entirely to me. Gavin possessed absolutely no legal jurisdiction over the Land Zero operational control over the heavy machinery and absolutely no legitimate means to execute the blueprints he had so proudly displayed moments earlier. He had knowingly pledged their legitimate fortunes to satisfy a toxic $4 million offshore loan he secured using completely forged property deeds. He was a desperate, severely over-leveraged middleman using their millions to frantically plug the massive bleeding holes in his offshore accounts and fund his illicit, romantic endeavors. I pointed directly at the high-resolution bank ledgers still glowing on the screen above his head. I told the investors that their initial substantial capital deposits were currently resting in the personal shell accounts of his offshore banker. I systematically dismantled the last remaining fragments of his professional credibility, exposing him as a desperate thief wearing a tailored tuxedo. The volatile silence in the grand ballroom instantly and violently shattered. The realization that they had been ruthlessly conned by a charismatic sociopath ignited a primal, uncontained fury among the city's most powerful financial elites. The polite high society gathering transformed into an aggressive, predatory mob in a fraction of a second. Furious venture capitalists and enraged local politicians surged violently toward the illuminated stage, their faces contorted with pure indignation. They shouted brutal obscenities, pointing angry fingers and demanding the immediate, unconditional return of their millions. The sheer physical force of the advancing crowd knocked over several round dining tables, sending towering crystal centerpieces and expensive champagne glasses shattering loudly against the polished floorboards. Gavin took a terrified step backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the slick surface of the stage. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his absolute destruction finally crushed his pathological arrogance into dust. He looked out at the sea of furious investors actively preparing to physically tear him apart, and he realized his entire life was completely over. There were no more charming lies to spin, no more legal loopholes to exploit, and absolutely no more time left to run. His trembling hands released their frantic grip on the acrylic podium. A thick stack of customized presentation notes slipped from his sweating fingers, fluttering uselessly to the floor like dead leaves. Driven purely by a pathetic animalistic instinct for survival, he turned his back on the furious crowd. He abandoned his grand vision, his fabricated legacy, and his remaining dignity, desperately sprinting toward the heavy, stainless steel kitchen service doors located directly behind the massive projection screen. It was his absolute last remaining physical escape route. I did not move to chase him, nor did I signal Tariq to intervene. We remained perfectly still in the center of the chaotic ballroom, watching the final act of this meticulously engineered tragedy unfold. Mitchell stepped forward, slightly raising his right arm. With chilling, calculated precision, the attorney pointed a single finger directly toward the stainless steel kitchen exit. As Gavin's trembling hands violently pushed against the metal crash bar to launch himself into the service corridor, the heavy double doors swung forcefully inward, violently rejecting his escape. Two heavily armed federal marshals stepped deliberately through the threshold, their imposing tactical gear contrasting sharply with the opulent surroundings. They instantly blocked the narrow corridor, completely eliminating Gavin's only remaining physical avenue of retreat. The blinding glare of the stage lights illuminated the metallic glint of the federal badges pinned securely to their chests. Gavin slammed on the brakes, his expensive dress shoes skidding uselessly against the stage floor. He was totally trapped between a mob of enraged millionaires demanding his blood and the absolute unyielding wall of federal law enforcement waiting to permanently secure his future. Gavin slammed his hands against the unyielding tactical vests of the federal marshals, a futile and pathetic attempt to physically force his way through the blockade. The larger of the two officers did not issue a verbal warning. He simply reached forward and locked a massive hand onto Gavin's tailored shoulder, spinning the desperate developer around with bone-jarring force. Gavin shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail as the second marshal seized his other arm. Blind panic completely overrode his remaining shreds of dignity. He fought back with wild, uncoordinated thrashing, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the officer's reinforced boots. He screamed hysterically into the cavernous ballroom, violently twisting his neck to look back at the illuminated stage and pointing a trembling finger directly at me. He shouted that I had framed him, that the entire financial disaster was a fabricated conspiracy engineered by a jealous, senile old man. He begged the wealthy investors standing just feet away to intervene, claiming the federal agents were corrupt pawns in my hostile corporate takeover. His cries fell on completely deaf ears. The elite socialites, venture capitalists, and politicians who had applauded his fabricated vision mere minutes ago now watched his violent apprehension in absolute disgusted silence. They stepped backward in unison, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits away from the thrashing criminal, treating him like a highly contagious disease. Gavin's erratic struggles proved entirely useless against the seasoned federal agents. With a swift, coordinated sweep of their legs, the marshals took Gavin completely off his feet. He crashed face first onto the polished tile floor of the service corridor, the sharp impact driving the remaining breath from his lungs and finally silencing his frantic, pathetic screams. The lead marshal dropped a heavy knee squarely between Gavin's shoulder blades, pinning the ruined developer firmly against the cold, hard tile. He reached into his tactical vest, retrieved a folded federal warrant, and began reading the charges aloud. His booming, authoritative voice echoed clearly through the sudden, suffocating quiet of the grand ballroom, broadcasting Gavin's absolute moral and legal bankruptcy to the most powerful individuals in the city. He formally cited multiple counts of aggravated federal wire fraud, meticulously detailing the illegal transfer of restricted municipal funds across international borders. He cited extensive premeditated identity theft, confirming Gavin's fraudulent manipulation of my personal estate documents to secure the catastrophic offshore loan. The list of atrocities continued to expand, each charge heavier and more devastating than the last. The marshal boldly announced a charge for conspiracy to commit arson, legally connecting Gavin to the intercepted arsonist currently sitting in a downtown interrogation room. He concluded the devastating litany with multiple counts of financial extortion. Gavin laid pinned against the floor, gasping for air, the terrifying reality of a multi-decade federal prison sentence crushing his spine. He twisted his head sideways, pressing his bruised cheek against the polished floorboards, desperately searching the silent crowd for a single sympathetic face. His frantic, bloodshot eyes locked onto Kendra. She stood rigidly near the expansive silk-draped buffet table, clutching a crystal champagne flute. She had followed him to the venue, likely hoping to witness his triumphant theft of my legacy, only to watch his brutal public execution instead. Gavin's voice cracked as he screamed her name across the ruined ballroom. He desperately ordered his wife to immediately contact their defense attorneys, begging her to access whatever hidden trust funds remained to post his inevitable bail. He pleaded with her to fix the disaster, invoking their marriage and their shared future. Kendra did not rush to his side. She did not shed a single tear for the man writhing on the floor. She simply stared down at his pathetic, weeping form with absolute chilling apathy. She calmly placed her crystal flute onto the nearest silver tray, turned her back on her husband without uttering a single word of comfort, and walked rapidly out of the ballroom, abandoning him entirely to his self-inflicted slaughter. The sharp, unmistakable, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Gavin's wrists echoed with striking finality. The marshals hauled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his pathetic, breathless sobbing. The arrogant, untouchable architect of my attempted destruction had been reduced to a weeping, ruined criminal, his tailored tuxedo torn and covered in the dust of the floorboards. The federal agents dragged him forcefully backward through the stainless steel service doors, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly against the ground. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, officially erasing Gavin from the high society world he had sacrificed everything to conquer. I stood firmly in the center of the grand ballroom, victorious over the shattered, smoking remnants of his fabricated reputation. The dense, volatile tension that had gripped the elite crowd slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a profound, calculating curiosity. The city's most powerful financiers turned their collective attention away from the service exit and focused entirely on the man who had just orchestrated the most flawless, devastating corporate siege in recent municipal history. A small contingent of the lead venture capitalists, the men holding the largest financial stakes in the immediate development, separated from the crowd. They approached me with a cautious, newfound reverence, treating me not as a retired, vulnerable patriarch, but as a ruthless, undisputed apex predator. The lead investor, a prominent real estate mogul, cleared his throat nervously. He gestured toward the blank presentation screen, his voice laced with careful hesitation. He asked me directly if the massive luxury project they had gathered to celebrate was completely dead in the water, fearing their initial substantial capital investments were permanently lost in the wake of Gavin's spectacular federal indictment. I looked at the anxious circle of elite investors and allowed a genuine warm smile to spread across my face. I calmly adjusted the lapels of my suit and assured them that their municipal aspirations were perfectly safe. I stated with absolute unwavering confidence that the fraudulent era of this project had officially ended, and the era of legitimate, unprecedented prosperity had just begun. I gestured proudly toward Tariq, who stood tall and unyielding by my side. I introduced him formally to the city's financial elite, no longer the erased phantom of a broken family, but the rightful, heavily armed heir to a legitimate logistical empire. I informed the captivated crowd that the luxury development was not dead. It was simply undergoing a massive, highly necessary change in management. I declared that my newly returned son and I would be taking over the entire construction operation, utilizing our vast, legitimate offshore capital to execute the blueprints on our own precise, uncompromising terms. The relief washing over the venture capitalists was instantaneous and profound. A single investor began to clap, and within seconds, the entire grand ballroom erupted into a deafening, unified roar of thunderous applause. The drive back to the estate from the downtown hotel was cloaked in a profound, absolute silence. Tariq maneuvered the vehicle with the same calm military precision he applied to every facet of his life, smoothly navigating the winding suburban roads while the chaotic, screaming aftermath of the gala faded into the distance behind us. When we finally pulled through the towering wrought-iron gates of the property, the sprawling stone house stood stark and quiet against the freezing night sky, save for the blazing crystal chandelier illuminating the main foyer. I stepped out of the vehicle, feeling the crisp, biting chill of the midnight air sink into the dark fabric of my tailored suit. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and crossed the threshold into my home. The chaotic energy of the evening was abruptly replaced by a frantic, scrambling noise echoing violently from the center of the marble hallway. Kendra was on her hands and knees in the middle of the floor, completely surrounded by the physical remnants of her shattered superficial life. She had dragged a massive, incredibly expensive designer suitcase down the grand staircase and laid it open like a gaping wound across the polished stone. She was blindly hurling handfuls of imported silk dresses, thick cashmere sweaters, and heavy velvet coats into the luggage without a single shred of care or organization. A velvet jewelry box sat completely overturned on the entryway console table, spilling diamond necklaces and heavy gold bracelets across the dark wood. She was actively tearing her own world apart in a desperate, hyperventilating race against time. She knew Gavin was currently sitting in a sterile federal interrogation room singing to the authorities to save his own skin, and she fully understood that the financial fallout would inevitably crash down on her head by morning. The sheer, unadulterated panic in her erratic movements betrayed her complete lack of an escape plan. She froze the instant she heard our footsteps approaching the hall, her shaking hands clutching a tangled cluster of diamond earrings. She darted her eyes between Tariq and me, wearing the trapped, wide-eyed stare of a cornered animal, realizing the hunters had already arrived. She did not immediately cower or attempt to offer a tearful, fabricated apology for her complicity. Instead, the raw terror in her eyes rapidly hardened into a brittle, fiercely defensive glare. She stood up slowly, dropping the tangled diamonds indiscriminately into her open suitcase, and smoothed the front of her ruined, expensive evening gown. Kendra raised her chin, desperately trying to summon the haughty, aristocratic entitlement she had worn like impenetrable armor for the past 5 years. She demanded that I instruct Mitchell to draft an immediate, highly generous severance package for her permanent departure. Her voice trembled violently, yet she forcefully insisted that she deserved massive financial compensation for enduring my supposed emotional instability and suffocating grief since Tariq's presumed death. She audaciously claimed that maintaining the polished, flawless facade of our family for the city's high society had been a grueling, entirely unappreciated labor, and she flatly refused to walk away empty-handed after years of managing my depression. I did not raise my voice or react to her venomous, self-serving accusations. I calmly reached into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a neatly folded, heavily printed financial ledger. Mitchell had compiled the extensive document hours before the gala, meticulously tracing the absolute rotting depths of her personal greed. I unfolded the thick paper and read the precise, damning figures aloud into the quiet foyer, letting the numbers strike her like physical blows. I explicitly detailed every single dollar Kendra had systematically siphoned from the estate accounts to finance her luxury goods, exclusive high-end spa retreats, and imported sports cars. I did not stop there. I ruthlessly exposed her ultimate betrayal, citing the exact dates and routing numbers where she had secretly attempted to drain my primary retirement fund, actively transferring the massive capital into a hidden offshore shell account registered under her maiden name. I explained exactly how she had forged my signature on secondary banking authorizations while I slept meticulously, preparing to leave me completely destitute the exact moment Gavin finalized his medical coup. Her entire fabricated narrative of victimhood and sacrifice evaporated into thin air under the crushing weight of the evidence. I looked directly into her shrinking, terrified eyes and told her she had never been a grieving sister or a burdened daughter. She was a highly calculated thief who had willingly traded her soul for a life of unearned luxury, and she was exactly the monster she had consciously chosen to be. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pallid gray under the bright, unforgiving light of the chandelier. The defiant glare melted instantly into absolute suffocating terror as the undeniable reality of the physical evidence crushed her pathetic demands for financial compensation. I folded the ledger with precise, deliberate movements and slid it back securely into my breast pocket. I looked at the extravagant grandfather clock standing against the far wall of the hallway, its heavy brass pendulum swinging with a steady, relentless, and echoing rhythm. I informed Kendra that she had exactly 5 minutes to completely and permanently vacate my property. I stated in a cold, unyielding tone that if she was still standing on my marble floor when the clock chimed the quarter hour, I would immediately instruct Mitchell to dispatch the local authorities and have her formally arrested for grand larceny and systemic financial fraud. I made it absolutely clear that her husband was currently providing the federal marshals with a comprehensive, highly detailed map of their criminal enterprise, and her name was already explicitly listed on multiple federal warrants waiting to be executed. The brutal, inescapable reality of her situation finally shattered her remaining delusions of grandeur. She had absolutely no leverage left to exploit, no more convenient secrets to hide behind, and no more wealth to steal from my accounts. She looked frantically at Tariq, desperately searching his stoic, commanding face for a single ounce of sibling mercy, but she found absolutely nothing but cold, judging silence. Kendra did not utter another word of protest. She violently zipped the overstuffed designer suitcase, the expensive fabric bulging dangerously against the reinforced seams. She gripped the heavy leather handle with shaking, bloodless fingers, turned her back on her family, and dragged the massive luggage awkwardly across the foyer. She pushed the heavy oak front door open and walked out into the freezing, unforgiving night without ever looking back. The heavy oak door swung shut behind her, the heavy brass latch clicking into place with a sharp, echoing finality that resonated deeply through the entire estate. The sound definitively marked the absolute conclusion of a dark, suffocating era of betrayal. Tariq stepped forward and smoothly slid the deadbolt into the locked position, securing the physical perimeter of the house with quiet, practiced military efficiency. I stood in the exact center of the grand foyer, drawing a deep, completely unobstructed breath of the cool, pristine air. The oppressive, lingering tension that had aggressively plagued my home for the last 5 years completely evaporated into the atmosphere, leaving behind a profound, immaculate peace. The sprawling stone house was finally purged of its internal corruption. The treacherous, toxic parasite that had fed relentlessly on my grief and actively plotted my total financial destruction was permanently and irrevocably removed from my life. The lingering shadows retreated, and the estate once again felt like a true sanctuary of genuine security and hard-earned family legacy. I looked at my resilient, resurrected son standing firmly beside me, both of us victorious, unbroken, and fully prepared to face the dawn. The heavy oak door had clicked shut, and with it the oppressive weight that had suffocated the estate for half a decade vanished entirely. The grand house, once a theater for Kendra and Gavin's grotesque display of unearned wealth and calculated deceit, now belonged solely to my son and me. The sprawling, high-ceilinged corridors were bathed in the soft, muted light of the crystal chandeliers. We walked side by side, our footsteps echoing in a synchronized, steady rhythm against the polished marble and rich hardwood floors. The silence between us was not the tense, paranoid quiet of the past 5 years. It was a profound, restorative peace. The air itself felt cleaner, purged of the toxic ambition that had infested every corner of my home. We ascended the grand, sweeping staircase, our hands brushing against the polished mahogany banister. We moved past the opulent guest suites that Gavin had arrogantly claimed as his private offices, and past the lavishly decorated sitting rooms Kendra had used to entertain her parasitic socialite friends. We ignored the superficial remnants of their occupation and navigated the winding, familiar path deep into the older, quieter wing of the estate. The corridor here was narrower, lined with tall, arched windows that framed the freezing, starlit night outside. Tariq walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his sharp eyes taking in the familiar architecture of his youth. We reached the very end of the second-floor hallway, stopping perfectly still in front of a heavy, solid oak door. The brass handle was tarnished with age, untouched by the frantic, greedy hands that had ransacked the rest of the property. It was the only room in the entire house that I had fiercely and absolutely forbidden anyone to enter. I reached deep into the interior pocket of my trousers, my fingers brushing past the cold fabric to retrieve a small, heavily worn brass key. The metal was smooth polished by 3 decades of me holding it tightly in my palm during the darkest, most agonizing hours of my grief. I slipped the key into the old lock. The mechanism turned with a heavy, satisfying metallic click that broke the pristine silence of the corridor. I gripped the tarnished handle, pushed downward, and eased the heavy oak door open. The hinges groaned slightly, protesting the sudden movement after years of absolute stillness. We stepped over the threshold, crossing from the modern, chaotic reality into a perfectly preserved capsule of the past. The room was untouched, frozen in time from the exact morning 30 years ago when Tariq had inexplicably vanished from my life. The air inside smelled faintly of old paper-polished wood and the distinct, lingering scent of boyish innocence. Tariq stepped forward, his military rigid posture softening as his eyes swept across the room. The moonlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating his old, neatly made childhood bed. The faded, primary-colored quilt lay perfectly flat, waiting patiently for a boy who had been forced to grow up far too fast in a brutal, unforgiving world. He walked slowly toward the sturdy wooden desk pushed against the far wall. His calloused, scarred fingers reached out to gently touch the gleaming gold surface of his old Little League baseball trophies, their brass nameplates catching the dim light. He traced the edges of a towering stack of vintage, brightly colored comic books precisely organized and untouched by dust or decay. Every single poster on the wall, every model airplane resting on the shelves, and every textbook neatly aligned on the desk stood exactly where he had left them. I had defended this single sacred space with vicious intensity, refusing to let the agonizing passage of time or the aggressive renovations of my treacherous adopted daughter erase the physical proof that my son had existed. The profound, crushing emotional weight of 30 stolen years crashed down upon us both, filling the room with an unspoken, devastating acknowledgement of the time, the milestones, and the ordinary life that had been violently ripped away from our family. Tariq turned slowly away from the wooden desk, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. The stoic, impenetrable exterior of the hardened tactical commander began to fracture, giving way to the raw, visceral vulnerability of a son who had finally found his way back home. The sharp, assessing glint in his eyes softened entirely, welling up with thick, silent tears that spilled over his scarred cheeks. We did not need to exchange grand, dramatic speeches. We did not require lengthy theatrical apologies for the years lost, or the agonizing pain we had both separately endured. The overwhelming truth of our reunion transcended any spoken language. I closed the physical distance between us with 3 rapid, deliberate steps. I reached out and pulled my son into a fierce, unbreakable embrace. Tariq wrapped his powerful arms tightly around my shoulders, burying his face against the fabric of my suit jacket. He gripped me with the desperate, clinging intensity of a drowning man who had finally reached the shore. I held him with every ounce of strength I possessed, anchoring him to the reality that the nightmare was definitively over. The agonizing, gaping void that had hollowed out my chest for 30 years was instantly completely filled. The lingering ghosts of my unrelenting grief, the suffocating paranoia, and the bitter isolation were violently banished from the room. In that singular quiet moment, we were not the ruthless corporate architect and the lethal offshore operative who had systematically annihilated Gavin and Kendra. We were simply a father and a son standing together in the sanctuary of the past, officially reclaiming the family and the unbreakable bond that the world had so viciously attempted to destroy. I eventually stepped back from the embrace, keeping both of my hands firmly planted on his strong shoulders. I looked directly into his tear-streaked face and allowed a genuine, expansive smile to break across my features. The heavy emotional toll of the evening gave way to a sharp, invigorating clarity. I reached down, picked up a thick, heavy-duty black trash bag that I had brought up from the kitchen, and pressed it firmly into Tariq's hands. I informed him that our emotional reunion was complete, and it was now time to execute the final, highly satisfying phase of our victory. I gestured back out toward the hallway, explicitly referencing the gaudy, tasteless statues, the overly expensive imported rugs, and the superficial artwork that Kendra and Gavin had aggressively scattered throughout the rest of my estate. I told my son that we were going to systematically box up every single remnant of their pathetic, parasitic existence and hurl it directly into the industrial dumpster freezing in the driveway. Tariq wiped his face, looked at the heavy black plastic bag in his hands, and flashed a brilliant predatory grin. The real work of reclaiming our home had officially begun. The heavy thud of the industrial dumpster echoing through the freezing winter night was the precise sound of my life being permanently cleansed. Every gaudy vase, every imported silk rug, and every superficial photograph Kendra and Gavin had used to mark their parasitic territory was ruthlessly bagged and discarded by my son and me. We erased their existence from the estate before the sun even had a chance to rise over the horizon. We spent the ensuing months not only clearing the physical rot from the house, but methodically untangling the complex web of fraudulent accounts Gavin had established. Tariq and I worked late into the night side by side in my private study, combining our resources and our intellect to secure the estate's future. That freezing dawn gave way to a rapid, transformative spring. 6 months passed with the blinding speed of a world finally shifting back onto its proper axis. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of my own home was entirely replaced by the sharp, invigorating energy of absolute progress. I sat at the head of a massive, polished glass table in a sleek, sunlit corporate boardroom located on the top floor of a towering downtown skyscraper. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the sprawling city skyline, a skyline my family was now actively preparing to reshape. Tariq sat directly to my right, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that matched my own. The hardened tactical commander had seamlessly transitioned into a formidable corporate executive. We were surrounded by towering, meticulously organized stacks of legal paperwork. This was not the fraudulent, empty air Gavin had desperately tried to sell to his blinded investors. This was the foundational bedrock of a massive, entirely legitimate real estate logistics venture. We were officially merging my decades of untouchable industry influence with Tariq's vast, pristine offshore capital. We were building an empire completely immune to the toxic greed that had so recently attempted to bury us both. Attorney Mitchell sat across from us, exuding the calm, clinical satisfaction of a man who had successfully engineered a flawless legal slaughter. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smoothly slid the final heavy contract across the polished glass surface toward my son. Before prompting us for the closing signatures, Mitchell opened his leather briefcase and provided a highly anticipated definitive update regarding the complete annihilation of our enemies. His voice was steady and entirely devoid of sympathy as he detailed the exact depths of their ruin. Gavin had surrendered. He had violently fought the initial charges, screaming his innocence right up until the federal prosecutors laid out the pristine surveillance recordings and the devastating bank routing numbers Tariq had covertly intercepted. The sheer crushing magnitude of the federal evidence against him had completely shattered his pathological arrogance. Faced with the absolute certainty of a brutal, highly publicized trial that would have easily resulted in a 30-year sentence, Gavin had desperately accepted a heavily restricted plea deal. Mitchell confirmed that the former architect of our misery had officially pled guilty to every single count of wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, beginning a mandatory non-negotiable 15-year sentence. The lavish tuxedos, the vintage champagne, and the offshore accounts were permanently replaced by a sterile concrete cell and the terrifying reality of his absolute powerlessness. Mitchell then turned the page of his ledger to address the fate of my adopted daughter. Kendra's devastation was far less spectacular, but infinitely more poetic. Stripped entirely of her stolen inheritance, completely locked out of my estate, and blacklisted from every elite social circle she had so desperately worshipped, she had rapidly descended into the suffocating poverty she had always feared. She was forced to sell her imported luxury car for pennies just to afford the security deposit on a cramped, dilapidated apartment. Mitchell reported that she was currently working a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a discount department store on the desolate industrial edge of the city. She spent her days folding cheap garments and answering to aggressive managers, completely isolated from the luxurious high society she had valued far above her own father's life and sanity. She was finally living the exact, miserable existence she had actively earned. Her total financial and social erasure was the ultimate, inescapable consequence of her boundless greed. The definitive closure of their pathetic narratives hung in the bright boardroom air, leaving no lingering shadows, no residual anger, and absolutely no loose ends. Tariq looked down at the final executive contract resting on the glass table. The document officially established him not as an heir waiting in the wings, but as the active legal co-CEO of our newly minted logistical empire. He picked up the heavy, solid gold fountain pen Mitchell had provided. Tariq did not hesitate. His hand moved with the steady, unyielding precision of a man who had finally stepped into the brilliant light of his true birthright. He signed the thick parchment, permanently securing his position at the absolute pinnacle of the industry. Tariq lifted the gold pen and extended his arm, handing the polished instrument directly to me. Our eyes met, sharing a silent, profound acknowledgement of the hell we had navigated to reach this exact sunlit room. I took the pen from my son. I did not use my left hand, nor did I rely on any residual weakness that Kendra and Gavin had once tried to exploit and manufacture. I grasped the gold barrel firmly with my dominant right hand, feeling the solid, undeniable strength coursing through my fingers. I leaned forward and pressed the nib against the pristine paper. I signed my name in bold, sweeping, aggressive letters right beside Tariq's signature. The dark ink flowed smoothly, officially cementing the unshakable legality of our new enterprise. The phantom threats of medical coups and forced institutionalization were reduced to absolute ash. My legacy was secure, actively protected by the very son I had spent 30 years grieving. Mitchell nodded with profound satisfaction, carefully gathering the signed contracts and locking them securely inside his leather briefcase. The attorney stood up and extended his hand across the glass table. We shook his hand firmly, silently acknowledging the brilliant, ruthless legal execution that had facilitated our total victory. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket, feeling the invigorating warmth of the sunlight pouring through the massive windows. Tariq matched my movement, standing tall and resolute at my side. We turned our backs on the boardroom and walked out into the executive corridor together. The elevator carried us smoothly down to the bustling lobby of the towering office building. The heavy glass doors slid open and we stepped out onto the busy downtown pavement. The freezing, treacherous night of our past was entirely gone. We walked forward into the bright, warm afternoon sun, no longer a fractured family hiding in the shadows, but two formidable, equal partners fully prepared to conquer the world on our own terms. The crisp afternoon air carried the distinct bitter aroma of roasted beans as I pushed open the heavy glass door of the downtown diner. The worn brass bells hanging above the frame jingled with a familiar, comforting rattle, announcing my arrival to the sparsely populated room. I bypassed the plush booths near the entrance and walked directly toward the back corner. I took my seat at the small square table positioned perfectly beside the large pane glass window. The surface of the table was mapped with a web of deep ingrained cracks in the faded formica, a physical testament to decades of ordinary, hard-working people sharing meals and quiet, unassuming conversations. It was the exact same humble, overlooked booth where this entire exhausting ordeal had officially begun, the precise location where Mitchell had first slid the damning financial dossier, detailing Gavin's massive offshore debt across the table. I folded my hands together, resting them against the cool surface, and breathed in the heavy scent of frying bacon and toasted bread. A waitress wearing a stained white apron approached my booth with a practiced, welcoming smile. She did not recognize me as the ruthless corporate architect who had recently annihilated the city's most prominent real estate developer, nor did she care. She simply flipped a heavy ceramic mug upright and poured a continuous steaming stream of dark black coffee until it reached the very brim. The dark liquid curled with thick white vapor, radiating a sudden comforting heat against my palms. I thanked her quietly, wrapping my fingers around the thick ceramic. The diner remained bathed in a soft, unassuming golden light, entirely insulated from the cutthroat, high-stakes corporate warfare that had dictated every waking second of my life for the past 6 months. The bells above the entrance jingled a second time, cutting sharply through the low hum of diner conversation. Tariq stepped through the doorway instantly, commanding the attention of the room without uttering a single word. He wore a sharply tailored slate-gray suit that perfectly mirrored the aggressive, uncompromising executive he had rapidly become. The rigid, defensive posture of the exiled operative was entirely gone, replaced by the relaxed, formidable stride of a man operating at the absolute height of his power. He navigated the narrow aisles between the crowded tables with practiced ease, his dark eyes locking onto my booth. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick, heavy-duty manila folder. This specific folder did not contain intercepted banking routing numbers, heavily redacted federal arrest warrants, or photographic evidence of illicit motel affairs. It contained the absolute future of our family legacy. Tariq slid into the vinyl seat directly across from me, dropping the heavy folder onto the cracked formica with a resounding, satisfying thud. He unfastened the top button of his suit jacket and immediately flipped the brass clasp of the folder open. He extracted a massive stack of oversized, high-resolution architectural blueprints, smoothing the thick paper flat across the table. These were the final municipally approved schematics for our newly centralized National Logistics Center. We leaned forward simultaneously, our heads bowed over the intricate grid of blue lines and white structural markers. Tariq pointed a scarred finger toward the reinforced loading bays on the northern elevation, meticulously breaking down the logistical flow of the heavy freight trucks. He detailed the specific tonnage capacities of the reinforced steel beams and the optimized routing of the internal supply chain. We debated the precise placement of the administrative offices, trading rapid, calculated adjustments with the effortless synchronization of two men who shared a singular unified vision. Tariq pointed to a minor redundant architectural flourish on the exterior rendering, making a dry, sarcastic comment about how Gavin would have undoubtedly plated the loading dock in cheap imported gold just to appease his blind investors. The tension broke instantly. I let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter, and Tariq joined in the rich, comfortable sound echoing warmly across the small table. It was an inside joke forged in the fires of a war we had definitively won. I leaned back against the worn vinyl of the booth, allowing the architectural blueprints to rest smoothly between us. I turned my gaze away from the table and looked out through the large, smudged window pane at the bustling downtown street. The afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the concrete, illuminating the steady, relentless flow of pedestrians and passing vehicles. The simmering, toxic disrespect that had plagued my existence for years was entirely eradicated. The explosive, calculated betrayals engineered by the people I had housed and fed were completely neutralized. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated with surgical, devastating precision had fundamentally purged the rotting infection from my estate. The parasitic greed that had relentlessly sought to drain my life's work and force me into a locked psychiatric ward had been legally and financially annihilated. Gavin was permanently caged in a federal cell, and Kendra was exiled to the suffocating margins of the society she worshipped. I had not fought this vicious corporate war simply to destroy them. I had fought to restore order, to reestablish boundaries, and to secure the absolute foundation of my legacy. In the process of dismantling my arrogant enemies, I had recovered the only asset that held any genuine lasting value. I had won back my son. The sprawling stone estate, the massive offshore capital, and the legitimate logistics empire meant absolutely nothing without the right man standing beside me to inherit the mantle. I had endured the silence, executed the masterstroke, and emerged with my family intact. The dense, complicated machinery of survival and retaliation finally powered down, leaving a pristine, immaculate quiet in my mind. The ambient clatter of the diner faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. I reached forward and wrapped my right hand securely around the thick handle of the ceramic mug. I lifted the heavy cup from the cracked formica, feeling the deep, radiating heat seep directly into my bones and chase away the last lingering chills of the past 5 years. I took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of the dark, bitter coffee, letting the familiar grounding taste anchor me completely in the present moment. I lowered the mug and looked across the table at Tariq. My son was already reviewing the secondary structural schematics, his dark eyes scanning the technical data with fierce, unbreakable focus. I smiled, a genuine, profound expression of absolute victory and paternal pride. The war was officially over. The enemy was erased. I drank my coffee in complete, unshakable peace. We left the diner behind the warm afternoon sun reflecting brilliantly off the hood of the vehicle as Tariq navigated the familiar winding route back to the estate. The drive was remarkably peaceful, entirely devoid of the suffocating paranoid tension that used to dictate my every waking hour when Gavin and Kendra occupied my home. When we finally pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates, the visual transformation of the property was immediately striking and profoundly symbolic. The sprawling flower beds flanking the long, sweeping driveway had been completely overhauled during our brief absence. The pathetic, crushed roses that Kendra had aggressively planted to mark her superficial aristocratic territory were entirely gone. In their place, a professional landscaping crew had installed robust, vibrant greenery and deep-rooted oak saplings, projecting an image of endurance and genuine organic life. I stepped out of the vehicle and paused on the pavement to simply look at my home. The imposing stone facade no longer felt like a cold, hostile fortress guarding a theater of endless deceit. It radiated a profound, welcoming warmth. The heavy, suffocating aura of toxic entitlement that my enemies had actively cultivated had been meticulously scrubbed from the very foundations of the property. The grand, towering windows reflected the bright, unfiltered sunlight rather than trapping the dark, cynical shadows of the past 5 years. Walking up the pristine stone steps and crossing the threshold, I felt the vibrant, pulsating energy of a home that had finally been allowed to breathe freely. The oppressive silence of isolation was permanently replaced by the comforting, grounded reality of absolute security. Every polished hallway and vaulted ceiling now belonged strictly to us, completely untainted by the parasitic greed that had so recently infected it. I left Tariq in the main foyer and walked deliberately down the quiet, sunlit corridor toward my private study. The heavy mahogany door swung open smoothly, revealing a personal space that had been entirely reclaimed and purified of any hostile presence. I walked directly toward the far wall where a newly installed state-of-the-art biometric safe sat flush against the rich oak paneling. I pressed my thumb firmly against the illuminated digital scanner. The heavy steel bolts retracted instantly with a deep, resonating mechanical thud, and the thick, impenetrable door swung outward on its reinforced hinges. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and withdrew the crisp, newly signed executive contracts establishing our massive national logistics empire. I placed the thick stack of monumental corporate documents carefully onto the top steel shelf. Then I reached into the interior security compartment of the safe and retrieved a fragile, yellowed piece of paper encased in a protective archival sleeve. It was Tariq's original birth certificate. I set the delicate, irreplaceable document down side by side with the aggressive, multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. The stark visual contrast between the fragile proof of my son's existence and the massive, undeniable proof of our shared future struck me with profound, grounding force. I stood in the quiet sanctuary of the study and allowed myself to deeply reflect on the sheer magnitude of the past 30 years. I had endured 3 decades of agonizing, hollow grief, forced to navigate a brutal, unforgiving world while carrying the suffocating weight of an impossible loss. When the enemy eventually infiltrated my home wearing the deceptive masks of a grieving daughter and a highly supportive son-in-law, I had not reacted with blind, explosive rage. I had realized early on that absolute, unwavering patience was the ultimate, most devastating weapon against pathological arrogance. I did not actually destroy Gavin and Kendra with my own hands. I had simply constructed a flawless, invisible financial cage and allowed the sheer crushing weight of their own boundless greed to annihilate them completely. They had eagerly and blindly rushed toward their own spectacular destruction, completely consumed by their desperate hunger for unearned wealth and fabricated social status. By holding my ground and meticulously orchestrating the silent adjustment, I had preserved my capital, legally obliterated my adversaries, and secured a pristine, untouchable foundation for my true heir. The sharp, sudden sound of the heavy sliding glass doors opening down the hall interrupted my deep, silent reflection. Tariq's voice carried clearly and brightly through the sprawling house, calling out to me from the expansive back porch. He announced with a loud, cheerful cadence that the charcoal was fully lit and the grill was officially ready for the evening. A few seconds later, the rich, unmistakable aroma of roasting hickory wood and sweet, smoky barbecue drifted through the open corridors, finding its way directly into the quiet confines of my study. That simple, incredibly familiar scent hit me with a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated nostalgia. It was the exact, comforting smell of the carefree, golden summer weekends we had shared decades ago, long before the tragedy had violently fractured our lives and plunged my entire world into darkness. It was the distinct scent of ordinary, unbroken family life, completely restored and functioning exactly as it was always meant to. I looked down one final time at the priceless items resting safely inside the reinforced steel vault. The painful past and the limitless future were perfectly aligned, safe, and eternally protected under my own roof. I pushed the heavy steel door of the safe closed. The complex multi-tiered locking mechanism engaged immediately, sealing the vault with a sharp, incredibly satisfying mechanical click that echoed through the room with absolute finality. I turned my back on the study, leaving the ruthless corporate warfare and the monumental legal victories securely locked away. The grueling high-stakes battles were decisively and permanently won, and there was absolutely no reason left to dwell on the miserable carnage of the defeated. I walked out of the room with a light, effortless stride, following the warm, inviting scent of hickory smoke down the hallway. I stepped out through the sliding glass doors and onto the wide, sun-drenched wooden porch. The late afternoon light cast a brilliant golden hue across the sprawling green lawn and the dense, quiet tree line bordering the edge of the estate. Tariq stood confidently beside the massive iron grill, expertly turning thick cuts of marinated meat with a long pair of steel tongs. He looked over his shoulder, caught my eye, and flashed a bright, completely untroubled smile that entirely erased the harsh, tactical scars of his exiled past. I walked forward and leaned comfortably against the sturdy wooden railing, letting the warm, restorative summer breeze wash over my face. I looked at the incredible, resilient man my son had become, the true, brilliant architect of his own survival, and the rightful, undisputed heir to my entire world. The calculated, silent war was definitively over. The sprawling estate was entirely purged of its toxic invaders. My life's work and my hard-earned legacy were absolutely permanently secured. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my son in the fading golden light, breathing in the undeniable scent of absolute peace. True power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and waits quietly. The most devastating weapon against arrogance is unwavering patience. When confronted by those who seek to exploit your kindness and steal your legacy, blind rage only accelerates your own downfall. Instead, you must construct invisible boundaries and allow the sheer weight of their unbridled greed to become their ultimate executioner. Authentic respect and genuine love cannot be bought, coerced, or artificially manufactured through financial dependency. By reclaiming your boundaries and protecting your peace, you secure not just your wealth, but the immaculate survival of your own soul and future. If you found value and strength in this story of reclaiming power, resilience, and unshakable legacy, please share it with others who might need these lessons. Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts and how you build your own invisible boundaries.